In the 1950s, a team of cuneiform scholars completing the first comprehensive English translation of the mul.APIN tablets housed in the British Museum's astronomical collection encountered something that has never been fully resolved in the academic literature. The mul.APIN series represents the most systematic body of celestial cartography surviving from ancient Mesopotamia, a document that divides the entire visible night sky into precisely bounded administrative regions, assigns governing deities to each zone, and calculates the positions of hundreds of individual stars with tolerances that modern astrometric software confirms as accurate to within a fraction of a degree. The sophistication of this document is not in dispute. What the translators found troubling was not what the tablets said, but what they conspicuously declined to say. The Sumerians and their Babylonian successors were meticulous namers. They named individual stars, catalogued meteor showers, tracked the heliacal risings of planets across centuries of continuous observation, and recorded all of it in a bureaucratic precision that treated the sky as a governed territory rather than a spiritual canvas. Across more than 4,000 cuneiform tablets containing astronomical content, virtually every detectable celestial phenomenon received a designation, a jurisdiction, and a recorded significance. 6 distinct celestial regions were mapped, bounded, named, and populated with specific stellar occupants, whose positions and behaviours were tracked with a precision that rivals medieval European astronomy. But the region above the 6th, implied by the mathematical structure of the system, referenced through boundary descriptions that define where it begins without stating what it is, and acknowledged in the mythological literature through circumlocutions that approach it without naming it, was treated differently from all the rest. In a civilization that named everything it knew, this region was not named. In an astronomical tradition that catalogued everything it could observe, this region was not catalogued. In a mythology that assigned divine administrators to every celestial jurisdiction, this region received no administrator whose name appears in any surviving text. This is the investigation we're about to undertake. The evidence spans the major cuneiform archives of Mesopotamia, the astronomical chambers of Egyptian temple complexes, the cosmological mathematics of Hindu sacred literature, the initiation structures of Greek mystery schools, and the growing database of modern astrophysical anomalies that may be converging on the same question from the opposite direction. If what follows challenges what you understood about the limits of ancient astronomical knowledge, consider following this investigation further. The implications of what these civilizations knew and what they chose not to record run considerably deeper than a question of celestial nomenclature. The mul.APIN tablets represent one of the most significant bodies of astronomical literature recovered from the ancient world, yet their full implications for understanding Mesopotamian celestial knowledge remain contested among scholars of the cuneiform tradition. Housed primarily in the British Museum under tablet series designations beginning with the letter K, these texts were compiled in their surviving form around 700 BC but preserve observational traditions and mathematical frameworks that Hermann Hunger of the University of Vienna and David Pingree of Brown University, in their landmark 1989 English translation published through the Austrian Academy of Sciences, traced back to at least 1200 BC and potentially to an observational baseline several centuries earlier than that. The tablets divide the night sky into 3 distinct pathways corresponding to the domains of the 3 primary Anunnaki, with each pathway containing specific star lists, rising and setting times calculated with remarkable precision, and administrative designations that treat the celestial sphere not as a spiritual canvas, but as a mapped and governed territory. What distinguishes mul.APIN from other ancient astronomical documents is its systematic thoroughness. Every star in its catalogue receives a pathway designation, a mythological identification, a calculated position, and a seasonal observation window. Every observable celestial phenomenon receives a mathematical framework for prediction. This level of systematic completeness makes the document's one conspicuous gap all the more significant, because a document this thorough does not omit things by accident. The physical corpus of the mul.APIN tradition consists of more than 30 individual tablets and fragments recovered across multiple excavation sites, with the two most complete exemplars designated BM 86,378 and BM 92,687 in the British Museum collection. These tablets, transcribed in the Neo-Assyrian period, but faithfully reproducing content whose internal astronomical data places its original compilation no later than 1200 BC, and whose mathematical consistency implies ongoing refinement from a baseline potentially centuries older, demonstrate a level of institutional dedication to celestial record-keeping that has no clear parallel in the surviving record of any ancient civilization. The document opens with a systematic listing of 36 stars that rise heliacally at monthly intervals throughout the solar year, a catalogue that functions simultaneously as a stellar almanac, a calendar system, and an administrative index for the larger body of astronomical observation that follows. Each of these 36 stars is assigned to one of 3 celestial pathways, and each pathway is assigned to one of the 3 primary figures in the Anunnaki hierarchy: Enlil in the north, Anu along the equatorial band, and Enki in the south. The language of assignment in these tablets is not the language of religious myth. It is the language of territorial administration. The same cuneiform terminology used to describe a provincial governor's jurisdiction over a specific territory is used to describe Enlil's jurisdiction over the northern stars. The same vocabulary applied to the administrative boundaries between Mesopotamian city-states is applied to the boundaries between celestial pathways. Scholars of Mesopotamian administration, including Mark van der Meeroop of Columbia University, whose 2004 study of ancient Mesopotamian urban organization examined the intersection of celestial and terrestrial administrative frameworks, have noted that this terminological parallel was not accidental, but reflected a genuine conceptual integration in which the sky was understood as a governed space operating according to the same administrative principles as terrestrial civilization. The celestial pathways were not metaphors for divine realms. They were jurisdictions, bounded, administered, and recorded with the same bureaucratic rigour applied to the provinces of the Akkadian Empire. The precision with which these jurisdictions were bounded and populated makes the document's structural anomaly all the more striking. The mul.APIN texts describe the northern, equatorial and southern pathways in exhaustive detail, providing star lists, rising and setting calculations, and boundary coordinates whose mathematical validity modern computational astronomy has confirmed repeatedly. They describe the relationships between the 3 pathways with the precision of a survey document, specifying exactly where each jurisdiction ends and the next begins. And then, above the highest boundary of the northernmost pathway, the document is silent in a way that reads, not as the silence of ignorance, but as the silence of an established convention. Hunger and Pingree observed this feature in their 1989 translation without fully exploring its implications, noting only that the northern boundary of the Way of Enlil terminates without a corresponding description of what lies beyond it, whereas the southern boundary of the Way of Enki terminates with explicit acknowledgement that no further cataloguing applies. The asymmetry is precise and deliberate. The southern edge of the system is closed. The northern edge is not closed. It simply stops. In a document whose organizational logic is otherwise immaculate, a document that assigns a position, a deity, a rising time, and a seasonal window to every catalogued object, the upward boundary above the highest northern stars is defined only by the absence of whatever would have defined it. The investigation that follows is, in large part, an attempt to understand what that absence contains. The northern pathway of Mesopotamian celestial cartography, designated in the mul.APIN texts as the Way of Enlil and encompassing stars visible between 30 and 90 degrees northern declination, contains 47 individual stellar entries, documented with a precision that has enabled modern astronomers to identify virtually every object on the list with confidence. Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, whose comprehensive analysis of Mesopotamian astronomical geography, published in 1998, remains the definitive scholarly treatment of the subject, demonstrated that the Way of Enlil corresponds to a celestial band extending from the northern circumpolar region down to approximately 17 degrees north of the celestial equator, a zone that encompasses the major constellations of the northern sky and the stars associated in Mesopotamian tradition with governance, weather control, and agricultural timing. The tablets from the Enuma Anu Enlil series, the vast collection of celestial omens housed in the British Museum under catalogue numbers running from K337 to K6600, confirm that observations along the Way of Enlil carried the greatest administrative weight in Mesopotamian celestial interpretation. These were not merely atmospheric regions that served symbolic functions. They were operational jurisdictions whose governing bodies were described in matter-of-fact, administrative language that parallels the vocabulary used in terrestrial provincial governance texts from the same archives. The precision of the stellar positions recorded for the 47 Enlil stars, when compared against modern astrometric catalogues corrected for precessional displacement to the epoch of 1200 BC, produces matching tolerances that imply either long-period observational averaging or access to instruments of greater optical precision than conventional ancient technology permits. The administrative weight assigned to these 47 stars within the Mesopotamian celestial system cannot be overstated. The Enuma Anu Enlil series assigns its most consequential omen categories to phenomena occurring within the Way of Enlil, with tablets covering this zone occupying the earliest and largest sections of the compendium's organizational scheme. The rationale for this prioritization becomes apparent when the Enlil stars are examined against Mesopotamian agricultural and calendrical needs. The heliacal risings of stars along the northern pathway provided the primary timing signals for planting, irrigation management, and harvest preparation across the Mesopotamian agricultural cycle. These were not ornamental astronomical observations. They were the operational backbone of an economy that depended on precisely timed agricultural interventions, and the stakes of miscalculation were measured in famine rather than scholarly error. The 47 star entries are organized within the tablets in a sequence that moves from westward setting to eastward rising positions, creating a systematic survey of the northern sky that functions simultaneously as a navigational reference and a temporal index. Each entry specifies the star's name in Sumerian, its Akkadian equivalent, the month of its heliacal rising, the number of days before or after the equinox at which it appears, and in most cases its positional relationship to neighbouring stars expressed in angular terms that modern translators have verified with considerable precision. The star designated mul.APIN, identified by modern astronomers as the star we call Regulus, is assigned a heliacal rising date that corresponds within 2 days to the date calculable from modern ephemeris tables for 1200 BC, a precision implying that the observation was either a carefully averaged result of multiple years of direct measurement or was calculated from a mathematical model whose underlying parameters were more accurate than unassisted naked-eye observation alone would normally support. Wayne Horowitz's 1998 analysis examined each of the 47 Enlil entries against the observable sky of Mesopotamia as reconstructed for the relevant epoch, and found that 44 of them correspond to identifiable stars with positional data accurate to within 1 degree. The remaining 3 entries describe objects whose characteristics match no star in the modern catalogue that would have been visible from Nippur or Babylon at the relevant epoch, yet whose described properties are far too specific to represent scribal invention. These 3 anomalous entries show positional characteristics consistent with objects visible from significantly higher latitudes, specifically latitudes between 50 and 60 degrees north, corresponding roughly to the regions of Anatolia and the South Caucasus. The implication is striking. Portions of the mul.APIN Northern Catalogue reflect observations made from geographical positions substantially removed from the Mesopotamian heartland, suggesting that the tradition producing this document extended geographically well beyond any single institutional centre. The administrative language applied to the Enlil stars throughout the Enuma Anu Enlil omen series provides additional evidence that the northern celestial zone was understood as a functioning jurisdictional territory rather than a symbolic or spiritual domain. The cuneiform phrase translated as within the border of Enlil, which appears as a technical designation for omens occurring within the northern pathway, uses the same lexical root as the phrase translated as within the administrative district of Nippur in the political correspondence of the AO3000 period. Assyriologist John Black of Oxford University, in his contribution to the collaborative Sumerian Dictionary project published by the University of Pennsylvania Museum in 2004, identified this terminological overlap as reflecting a genuine conceptual equivalence in Mesopotamian administrative thought between territorial governance on Earth and celestial territorial governance above it. The Enlil stars were not in Enlil's mythological domain. They were in Enlil's administrative jurisdiction, governed by the same principles as the terrestrial territories under his earthly authority. John Steele of Brown University, applying modern statistical methods to the positional data in a 2011 paper published in the Archive for History of Exact Sciences, demonstrated that the internal consistency of the Enlil star positions is higher than what random variation in naked-eye observational estimates would produce, even across a 5-century averaging period. The residuals, the tiny differences between the recorded positions and the mathematically optimal values for the epoch, show a systematic pattern suggesting the values were calculated rather than directly observed, derived from a mathematical model using parameters whose derivation required either extraordinary instrumental precision or access to a longer baseline of records than any surviving institutional continuity in Mesopotamia would conventionally account for. What institution maintained records of this quality across what time period and whether those records extended above the northern boundary of the 47 named stars into a seventh celestial zone that the surviving tablets decline to document is a question the evidence consistently raises without answering. The equatorial band that Mesopotamian astronomers designated as the Way of Anu presents the most astronomically precise section of the mul.APIN star catalogue, containing 33 stellar entries whose positions, as verified through modern computational astrometry, align with the ancient descriptions within tolerances approaching half a degree. Anu's pathway encompasses the band of sky between 17 degrees north and 17 degrees south of the celestial equator, a region corresponding closely to what modern astronomy recognizes as the zodiacal belt, where the ecliptic crosses the celestial equator at the equinoctial points. The precision of this designation is not coincidental. Analysis by Francesca Rochberg of the University of California, Berkeley, whose scholarship on Babylonian mathematical astronomy has reshaped the field since her 2004 study of the relationship between Babylonian and Greek predictive astronomy, demonstrates that Anu's pathway was specifically calibrated to contain the fundamental reference stars necessary for tracking the precession of the equinoxes, the 25,920-year cycle that shifts the position of the celestial equinoxes against the stellar background. Within the 33-star catalogue of the Way of Anu, 7 entries carry an additional designation that appears nowhere else in the mul.APIN text, a cuneiform symbol that different translators have rendered as boundary marker, gateway indicator, or threshold sign, and whose consistent appearance at specific points along the equatorial pathway suggests that the Way of Anu was not merely a stellar catalogue, but a series of calibrated transition points between different celestial administrative regions. The question of what those transition points were transitioning toward, particularly the uppermost ones, becomes central to understanding the document's structural gap. The 7 threshold markers within the Way of Anu's 33-star catalogue are the most structurally distinctive feature in the entire mul.APIN text. Cuneiformist John Koch, in a 1996 analysis of the mul.APIN boundary markers published in the journal Archiv für Orientforschung, identified these 7 symbols as belonging to a distinct cuneiform logogram category, not otherwise attested in astronomical contexts, and noted that their placement within the Anu catalogue follows a spacing pattern that divides the equatorial band into 8 sections of approximately equal angular width. 7 divisions create 8 sections, and this numerical relationship carries resonance with the 7 heaven tradition's structural logic. A series of divisions that creates one more zone than the number of markers that separate them. The uppermost marker in the series, positioned at the highest declination within the Way of Anu, points toward the boundary where the Way of Anu ends and the Way of Enlil begins. The mathematical extension of the series above that boundary, following the equal spacing pattern that governs the other 6 markers, would place an 8th marker within the Way of Enlil. But the series ends precisely there, and the text continues as if the boundary the final marker indicates leads somewhere the subsequent catalogue declines to follow. Rochberg's 2004 work, The Heavenly Writing, published by Cambridge University Press, examined the theoretical foundations underlying the mul.APIN pathway system and concluded that the equatorial boundary markers represent a more sophisticated understanding of celestial coordinate geometry than the document's surface simplicity suggests. The Way of Anu was not a broad band defined casually by its central stars, but a calibrated coordinate system whose boundaries were precisely calculated to remain valid across the full precessional cycle, adjusting their effective content as the equinoctial points shifted against the stellar background over millennia. This processional calibration, embedded in the pathway design rather than stated explicitly anywhere in the text, requires knowledge of the full 25,920-year great year to implement correctly, not merely awareness of its short-term observable effects. A coordinate system calibrated against the full precessional period is a system designed to remain useful across timescales that dwarf any individual civilization's lifespan, and the institutional implication of that design choice is one the conventional historical framework of ancient Mesopotamia cannot comfortably absorb. The 33 equatorial stars include objects spanning the full range of brightness and observational significance, from brilliant equatorial stars near the ecliptic to relatively faint objects whose careful inclusion suggests they serve reference functions within the coordinate system rather than observational convenience. Among these reference stars, the 7 that carry threshold designations include objects whose positions at the epoch of 1200 BC mark the boundary where the ecliptic crosses the celestial equator at the equinoctial points, the exact locations where precessional motion is most directly measurable across successive years. An astronomer wishing to track the long-term displacement of the equinoctial points, and thereby detect and measure the rate of the precessional cycle, would place precisely these stars under continuous observation and return to them repeatedly across decades and centuries. The threshold markers in the mul.APIN equatorial catalogue are not arbitrary. They mark the optimal observation points for detecting and calculating the great year, and their consistent appearance across multiple independent copies of the mul.APIN text confirms they were original elements of a designed system rather than later scribal additions. The uppermost threshold marker bears most directly on the 7th celestial zone question. Its position at the northern boundary of the Way of Anu means it marks the transition between Anu's equatorial jurisdiction and Enlil's northern jurisdiction. Its existence implies, by the logic of the marker series, that there is something beyond the boundary it indicates. Transition markers indicate transitions, and a transition requires a destination. The mul.APIN text follows every other boundary marker in this series with a description of what lies beyond it. The 7th marker is followed only by the continued catalogue of the Way of Enlil, whose own northern boundary is, as we have established, the precise location where the document's systematic thoroughness terminates without explanation. The southern celestial pathway assigned to Enki in Mesopotamian astronomical literature encompasses the sky below 17 degrees south of the celestial equator, a region that presented particular observational challenges to astronomers working at the latitudes of Nippur and Babylon, where these stars barely cleared the southern horizon before atmospheric extinction reduced their visibility. Yet the mul.APIN entries for the Way of Enki demonstrate equally precise astronomical knowledge, listing 15 primary stars including the object the text calls the Star of Eridu, long identified by scholars as Canopus, the second brightest star in the night sky and the primary navigational beacon of the southern hemisphere. Wilfrid Lambert of the University of Birmingham, whose decades of work on Babylonian religious and literary texts produced the definitive studies of Mesopotamian creation mythology, noted in his analysis of the southern pathway designations that the Enki stars consistently carry associations with hidden knowledge, subterranean resources, and what the texts describe as wisdom that originates from beneath and rises, a characterization consistent with the deity's associations with the Apsu, the underground freshwater ocean that Sumerian cosmology placed below the earth. The 15 stellar entries for the Way of Enki include 3 objects that do not correspond to any stars visible from Nippur or Babylon at the epoch in question, yet whose described positions, brightness characteristics, and seasonal behavior match observable objects precisely when the viewing latitude is adjusted to approximately 22 degrees south, the latitude of ancient Nubian astronomical observation stations. The implication that certain entries in the mul.APIN Southern Catalogue were based on observations made from significantly lower latitudes than Mesopotamia raises questions about the geographic extent and organizational coordination of the astronomical tradition that produced the document. Lamber's observations regarding the hidden knowledge associations of the Enki stars connect to a broader pattern in Mesopotamian religious and administrative literature that has not been fully integrated into astronomical scholarship. The Southern Pathway's deity is characterized throughout Sumerian literature not merely as a god of water and wisdom, but specifically as the keeper of knowledge that originates before the current cosmic order. The Sumerian composition known as Enki and the World Order, preserved in multiple fragmentary copies from the Old Babylonian period, and examined in a definitive scholarly edition by Bent Alster of the University of Copenhagen in his 1997 work on Sumerian wisdom literature, describes Enki as the one who knows the deep before it was named, a formulation positioning him as the possessor of knowledge, predating the administrative organization of the cosmos that the mul.APIN text otherwise documents. The association of the Southern Celestial Pathway with precisely this deity, the one who holds knowledge from before the named order, adds an interpretive dimension to the Southern Catalogue's anomalous entries that purely astronomical analysis does not capture. The 3 non-visible objects in the Way of Enki catalogue, whose positions match observable stars only when the viewing latitude is shifted approximately 22 degrees southward from Nippur, represent an organizational decision whose implications extend considerably beyond scribal error. These 3 entries are not marginal additions appended to the main list, but are integrated into the sequential structure of the Southern Star Catalogue at positions that their seasonal behavior values indicate belong chronologically between specific surrounding entries. Their positions within the catalogue are embedded, not peripheral. Someone who compiled this catalogue either deliberately included observations from southern latitudes as part of a unified document, or inherited a composite document from a source that had access to both Mesopotamian and more southerly observational data, and chose to present that composite as a single coherent astronomical system. The ancient Nubian astronomical tradition, centered at sites along the Nile corridor and documented by archaeoastronomer Kim Malville of the University of Colorado in his analysis of the Nabta Playa megalithic complex, published in the journal Nature in 1998, demonstrates that sophisticated stellar observation was being practiced in the region of approximately 22 degrees north latitude as early as 5000 BC, centuries before the mul.APIN compilation period. Nabta Playa, located in the Egyptian Sahara at a latitude of 22 degrees 30 minutes north, contains stone circles whose alignments Malville identified as tracking the heliacal risings of stars, including several whose positions in the southern sky would be optimal for observation from this latitude. The stars tracked at Nabta Playa include objects whose seasonal behavior matches precisely the descriptions in the anomalous Enki catalogue entries, raising the possibility that the Southern Pathway's non-Mesopotamian observations derive from a shared observational tradition operating across a geographical range that connected the Nile Valley to the Tigris-Euphrates basin through institutional channels that left no explicit documentary trace. The organizational implications of this connectivity are profound. A celestial catalogue that integrates observations from multiple geographical locations spanning 15 degrees of latitude, requires institutional coordination that transcends any single city-state or regional political authority. The mul.APIN tradition, if its content reflects the integration of observations from Mesopotamia, the South Caucasus, and the Nubian region simultaneously, was the product of an institution whose geographical reach and organizational continuity exceeded anything that conventional historiography attributes to Mesopotamian scholarly culture of the relevant period. This was not local knowledge. It was a coordinated international scientific enterprise operating across distances that dwarf the political boundaries of any known Mesopotamian polity. The Southern Pathway's anomalous entries do not represent scribal mistakes. They represent evidence of the institution that the mul.APIN texts conceal within their systematic precision, an institution large enough and old enough to accumulate observations across a geography that the texts never acknowledge, and a time frame that the surviving historical record cannot easily contain. Embedded within the stellar catalogues of the mul.APIN texts lies a mathematical framework whose full extent was not recognized until computational analysis became available to cuneiform scholars in the 1980s. The Assyriological work of Asger Abo of Yale University, combined with the astronomical calculations of John Steele of Brown University, published in a 2007 analysis of Babylonian mathematical methods, revealed that the star positions, rising times, and pathway boundaries in mul.APIN are not independent observations, but components of a unified mathematical system built on relationships derived from the base 60 numerical framework that Mesopotamian mathematics employed for complex calculations. The fundamental unit of this system is the SAR, equal to 3,600, and multiples and fractions of this number appear throughout the mul.APIN astronomical data in patterns that cannot be coincidental. The interval between successive star risings along any given pathway, when converted to the base 60 system, produces values that are invariably multiples of 60, 90, or 180, suggesting that the recorded observations were not raw data, but calculated positions derived from a mathematical model of celestial motion. What this implies is significant beyond its technical dimensions. A mathematical model of celestial positions requires not only long-term observation, but theoretical understanding of the mechanisms underlying celestial movement. The precision of the mul.APIN framework requires, at minimum, an observational baseline of 500 years of systematic records to achieve the accuracy the tablets document. The question of what institution maintained those records across 5 centuries of potential political disruption, and whether those records extended to a 7th celestial region that the surviving text conspicuously declines to document, remains unanswered in conventional scholarship. The specific mathematical relationships that Abo identified in his 1991 analysis of Babylonian astronomical computation, published in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society, involve what modern mathematicians would recognize as a linear zigzag function, a computational method that models the variation in celestial phenomena across the year as a regular increase followed by a regular decrease following a precisely defined periodic pattern. This zigzag function, which appears in its most developed form in the Babylonian mathematical astronomy of the Seleucid period, is present in embryonic form in the mul.APIN rising time calculations, suggesting that the theoretical framework underpinning later Babylonian mathematical astronomy was already implicit in the earlier observational tradition. The mathematical continuity between the mul.APIN framework and the sophisticated function systems of Seleucid Babylonian astronomy separated by 6 or more centuries of recorded history, implies either extraordinary intellectual precocity in the original mul.APIN tradition, or the survival of a more developed mathematical framework from which both the mul.APIN text and the later Seleucid systems independently drew their foundational parameters. Steele's 2007 analysis examined the computational parameters embedded in the mul.APIN rising time data and compared them against the parameters independently derived by Seleucid period Babylonian astronomers for their more sophisticated predictive systems. The degree of correspondence between these parameters, separated by 6 centuries of intervening history and preserved in documentary forms that show no direct textual link, is statistically remarkable. Steele calculated that the probability of achieving this level of parameter correspondence through independent development of the same computational approach from independent observational data falls below 1 in several hundred, suggesting that both the mul.APIN tradition and the Seleucid mathematical astronomy tradition were drawing on common source parameters rather than deriving their mathematical frameworks from scratch. The source of those common parameters and the institution that maintained access to them across the intervening centuries is identified nowhere in the surviving textual record. The Sa and its multiples appear throughout the mul.APIN mathematical framework in patterns that connect the celestial cartography of the tablets to the chronological frameworks of Sumerian historical tradition. The mul.APIN division of the year into 36 10-day periods for the heliacal star list, when multiplied by the base 60 unit, produces 2,160, exactly 1/12 of the 25,920-year precessional cycle. The division of the full star catalogue into 3 pathways containing 47, 33 and 15 entries, totaling 95 individual stars, connects through star-related multiplication to the canonical numbers of Babylonian zodiacal calculation, in ways that Abbe identified as almost certainly deliberate. These mathematical relationships are not decorative. They embed the precessional mathematics of the Great Year into the structural architecture of the celestial mapping document, encoding the long-term temporal framework of the full cycle within an instrument designed for annual observational use. What this mathematical embedding implies about the institutional history behind mul.APIN is difficult to overstate. Encoding the full 25,920-year precessional period into the structural mathematics of a celestial catalogue requires not merely awareness that the precession exists, but precise measurement of its rate, which in turn requires an observational baseline of at minimum several centuries of consistent stellar position records compared against a theoretical framework capable of interpreting what those records mean. The Mesopotamian historical record provides no institutional context that could account for this baseline within the conventional framework of Mesopotamian cultural development beginning in the 4th millennium BC. The mathematical skeleton of the mul.APIN text implies an observational tradition older than Sumer, preserved by an institution whose continuity extended across the civilizational disruptions that conventional archaeology places at the beginning of the historical record. This institutional reality, an astronomical tradition with organizational continuity spanning centuries or millennia, a mathematical framework of precessional sophistication embedded in a document compiled around 1200 BC from sources demonstrably older, and a geographical reach extending from the Caucasus to the Nubian desert, makes the 7th celestial zone's systematic absence from the record all the more significant. This was not an institution limited by what it could observe or calculate. The mathematics embedded in the 6 named pathways demonstrates capabilities that could have documented a 7th region if such documentation had been the institutional decision. the decision appears to have been otherwise, and understanding why requires following the same conspicuous silence through the astronomical traditions of the civilizations that inherited and extended what Mesopotamia chose to preserve. The concept of seven heavens appears with remarkable consistency across the textual traditions of Mesopotamia, yet the astronomical literature that would be expected to document the seventh heaven systematically describes only 6 celestial regions with operational precision. The mul.APIN texts identify 3 pathways, each of which the Babylonian astronomical tradition subsequently divided into 2 functional tiers through the system of inner and outer stars, producing 6 distinct celestial administrative zones that are mapped, bounded, named and populated with specific stellar occupants. A 7th region is consistently implied by the mathematical structure of this system. The pathway boundaries leave a celestial zone unaccounted for that falls above the highest designated region of the Way of Enlil, beyond the circumpolar stars that Mesopotamian astronomers tracked and named with evident confidence. References to this zone appear throughout Mesopotamian literature in language that acknowledges its existence without specifying its nature. The Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish, in its description of Marduk's cosmic reorganization, states that he established 3 heavens above the 3 he had already set in order, a cumulative statement that cuneiformist Wilfred Lambert, working from the British Museum's Assyrian tablet collection in his 1990 study, noted produces 6 ordered heavens plus whatever existed before Marduk's intervention. The text explicitly declines to name what preceded the cosmic ordering, describing it only as what was above the highest established place. This linguistic pattern, acknowledging a region through its boundaries rather than its identity, appears not once but across dozens of passages in the major cuneiform archives, a frequency that suggests systematic convention rather than isolated literary choice. The inner and outer star division that transforms mul.APIN's 3 pathways into 6 operational zones is documented most completely in the Babylonian star catalogue known as 3 stars each, a text surviving in copies housed at the British Museum under catalogue designations BM 86378 and BM 92687, the same tablets that preserve the most complete mul.APIN versions. 3 stars. Each assigns 1 inner star and 1 outer star to each month of the year for each of the 3 pathways, producing a grid of celestial observation points that divides each pathway into a near component close to the pathway boundary with Anu and a far component approaching the outer limit of the zone. The practical effect of this division is to create 6 distinct bands of celestial observation rather than 3, with the northern pathway's outer band, the zone of Enlil's farthest stars, occupying the position immediately below the uncharted zone above the system. Assyriologist Erica Reiner of the Oriental Institute in Chicago, whose analysis of the 3 stars each tablets published in 1998 demonstrated the organizational sophistication underlying their apparent simplicity, noted that the outer band of the Way of Enlil is the only zone in the 6-part system that lacks a paired inner band. Every other zone in the 6-part structure has both an inner and outer component. The outermost northern band has only an outer component. The inner component that would complete it symmetrically would have to lie above the highest catalogued stars, in the zone the text declines to populate. The Enuma Elish passage that Lambert examined in his 1990 study provides the most direct textual evidence that this structural gap was recognized and deliberately maintained rather than simply unaddressed. The relevant section of the creation epic preserved on the 5th tablet of the standard Babylonian version and surviving in multiple copies from Assurbanipal's library at Nineveh, describes Marduk's cosmic reorganization following his defeat of Tiamat as a systematic administrative act. Marduk creates the celestial regions, assigns the stars to their positions, establishes the year's length, and sets the pathways of the three great gods in order. The text then states that he fashioned stations for the great gods, setting up their likeness as the stars of the zodiac, and fixed the year, defining its limits. What follows in the organizational sequence is a reference to regions above the highest established station that Lamba translated with notable circumspection, rendering it as the place whence the brightness comes, a phrase whose deliberate vagueness in the original Akkadian he acknowledged was unlikely to be accidental given the precision of the surrounding text. The phrase "whence the brightness comes" appears in variant forms across multiple Mesopotamian astronomical and literary contexts, in passages that approach the upper celestial boundary from below. Tablet K 2953 in the British Museum collection, part of a series of late Babylonian astronomical commentaries analysed by David Brown of Humboldt University in his 2,000-year monograph on Mesopotamian planetary astronomy, uses a closely related phrase in a commentary on the upper limit of a planetary observation sequence. The commentary notes that the planet being tracked cannot be followed above the last established station because the region above is not named in the appointed series. The phrase "not named in the appointed series" is technically precise in a way that "whence the brightness comes" is not. It indicates not that the region is unknown, but that it is specifically excluded from the naming system that organizes the appointed series. The exclusion is systematic, and the word "appointed" indicates it was designed rather than incidental. The mythological framework surrounding Anu, whose pathway defines the celestial equatorial zone and whose name shares its root with the Sumerian word for sky itself, provides additional evidence that the seventh celestial region was understood as Anu's primary domain rather than his equatorial pathway. Throughout Sumerian and Babylonian literature, Anu is described as dwelling in the highest heaven, a location that cannot be the equatorial band named after him in the mul.APIN system, since that band is thoroughly catalogued and operationally mapped. If Anu's actual dwelling corresponds to the named way of Anu, the literary tradition of his inaccessible heights makes no geographical sense within the celestial cartography. But if Anu's true domain is the unnamed region above the 6 catalogued zones, a region consistently acknowledged through references to the highest heaven, without being populated with star catalogue entries, the literary tradition becomes geographically coherent. Anu lives where the astronomical literature declines to go, and his pathway through the equatorial band is not his home, but his administrative jurisdiction in the organized cosmos below. The Enuma Anu Enlil, the vast compendium of celestial omens that represents the most extensive body of astronomical literature surviving from ancient Mesopotamia, contains more than 7,000 individual omen entries organized according to the 3-pathway system of the mul.APIN texts. Tablets from this series, the majority housed in the British Museum under catalogue numbers extending from K200 to K14000, document the interpretive significance of virtually every detectable celestial phenomenon, including eclipses, planetary positions, meteor showers, cloud formations, and stellar colour variations. The systematic thoroughness of this documentation makes its treatment of the uppermost celestial zone all the more revealing on close examination. Across more than 7,000 omen entries, the Enuma Anu Enlil describes phenomena associated with the Way of Enlil, the Way of Anu, and the Way of Enki in exhaustive detail, with entries for the northern pathway alone occupying more than 30 tablet columns in the standard series. Yet the zone above the highest northern stars, a region that the mathematical structure of the system implies must exist, and that later traditions from multiple cultures explicitly identify as a distinct domain, receives no systematic omen treatment in the Enuma Anu Enlil corpus. The few references that do appear describe this upper region in terminology, borrowed from descriptions of Anu's highest domain, rather than in the dedicated technical vocabulary that characterizes every other celestial region in the series. Hermann Hunger, in his collaborative translation of the Enuma Anu Enlil series published through the Austrian Academy of Sciences between 1989 and 2012, noted this terminological inconsistency without resolving it, observing only that the upper boundary references employ language more characteristic of mythological narrative than of the operational astronomical vocabulary that governs the rest of the series. The organizational architecture of the Enuma Anu Enlil is one of the most remarkable achievements of ancient scholarly compilation. The series, as reconstructed from surviving tablets, contains approximately 7,000 individual omen entries, though estimates by Francesca Rochberg and other specialists in Babylonian celestial divination place the original complete series closer to 7,500 entries, distributed across approximately 70 tablets. Each entry follows a standardized format consisting of a protosis describing an observable celestial condition, including its location, timing, associated planetary positions, and qualifying atmospheric circumstances, followed by an apodosis specifying the terrestrial consequences that the observed condition signifies. The precision of the protosis descriptions is sufficient in many cases for modern astronomers to calculate the exact celestial event being described and confirm its astronomical validity. The apodosis interpretations are beyond the scope of modern empirical verification, but the protosis precision demonstrates that the observational foundation of the series was grounded in genuine astronomical knowledge rather than arbitrary classification. What makes the Enuma Anu Enlil's treatment of the upper celestial boundary particularly significant is not that the boundary region is ignored, but that it receives a specific and consistent type of non-treatment that differs structurally from all other boundary conditions in the series. When an omen entry in the Enuma Anu Enlil describes a phenomenon occurring near the boundary between the Way of Anu and the Way of Enlil, the standard vocabulary of the series is applied without modification. The phenomenon is located with reference to the named boundary. Its significance is specified, and the entry proceeds as normal. When an omen entry approaches the upper boundary of the Way of Enlil, the language shifts. The phenomenon is no longer located with reference to a named boundary. It is described as occurring above the last station of Enlil, or at the limit of the appointed path, or in the region where the star of Anu grows bright. These phrases do not function as astronomical coordinates in the technical vocabulary of the series. They are literary circumlocutions that acknowledge a location without specifying it within the coordinate system that applies everywhere else. Hunger's identification of this terminological shift was methodologically careful and worth examining in its full implications. The Enuma Anu Enlil series has a technical vocabulary for every kind of astronomical boundary condition that appears within its 7,000 plus entries. Boundaries between the three major pathways are described with standardized terminology. Boundaries between inner and outer stars within each pathway are described with standardized terminology. Boundaries between the daytime and nighttime sky for horizon observations are described with standardized terminology. The boundary above the 6th zone is described with terminology that appears nowhere else in the series, and that borrows literary rather than astronomical language for its formulation. This is not the vocabulary of a document that lacks information about a region. It is the vocabulary of a document that has been instructed how to reference a region it is not authorized to catalogue. The distribution of the 7,000 omen entries across the 3 pathways provides further evidence of this authorized exclusion. The Way of Enlil, which encompasses the most astronomically significant zone for agricultural and political omen interpretation, receives approximately 42% of all entries in the series, corresponding to roughly 2,940 individual omens. The Way of Anu receives approximately 35%, corresponding to approximately 2,450 entries. The Way of Enki, the southern pathway presenting the greatest observational challenges from Mesopotamian latitudes, receives approximately 23%, corresponding to approximately 1,610 entries. The gradient from north to south follows a logical pattern of decreasing observational access and decreasing omen frequency. If the series simply extended above the 6th zone as it extended below the 3rd, the upper zone should contain the densest concentration of entries of all, since the circumpolar stars it would encompass are the most continuously visible objects in the Mesopotamian sky. Instead, there are 0 systematic entries. The gradient that should accelerate toward maximum density at the upper boundary inverts to 0 at precisely the point where the mathematical structure predicts the highest concentration. The library of Assurbanipal at Nineveh, assembled in the 7th century BC by the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and containing more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets when excavated by Austin Henry Layard, beginning in 1849, represents the single most comprehensive archive of ancient Mesopotamian knowledge ever recovered. The library's astronomical section, which Assurbanipal's scribes compiled through systematic collection and copying of texts from temple archives across Mesopotamia, provides a unique opportunity to compare celestial knowledge across different regional institutional traditions within a single consolidated collection. When tablets from different regional archives covering identical astronomical phenomena are examined side by side, the omen entries and star catalogues show expected minor variations in scribal tradition, local astronomical conditions, and institutional emphasis that reflect the diversity of Mesopotamian scholarly culture. But entries that approach the boundary of the 6th celestial region and reference what lies above it show a pattern of convergence that stands out sharply against the background of normal scribal variation. Across tablets sourced from Babylon, Nippur, Assur, Uruk, and Larsa, the language used to approach the upper boundary becomes remarkably consistent, employing identical or near-identical phraseology that has no equivalent in how other astronomical boundaries are described. Irving Finkel of the British Museum's Cuneiform collection, who has worked with the Nineveh archive for 4 decades and whose studies of scribal transmission patterns are among the most rigorous in the field, has noted that this kind of convergent language in an otherwise diverse scribal tradition typically indicates either direct copying from a single authoritative source or systematic standardization by an editorial authority with the institutional power to enforce consistency across multiple independent archives. The language of celestial avoidance appears to have been officially standardized. The Nineveh Library's significance for this investigation extends beyond its size to the specific manner in which Assurbanipal assembled it. Royal inscriptions describing his scholarly activities, preserved on prisms and clay cylinders in the British Museum, indicate that Assurbanipal personally supervised the collection effort and claimed the ability to read cuneiform script himself, an unusual competence for a Mesopotamian monarch, and one that scholars, including Kirk Grayson of the University of Toronto in his editions of the Assyrian royal inscriptions published between 1972 and 1996, have connected to Assurbanipal's identity as a scholar king who understood the content of what he was collecting. The library was not an indiscriminate accumulation. It was a curated scholarly archive, and the decisions about what to include, how to organize it, and what language to apply to sensitive boundary cases reflect editorial choices made by individuals who understood the astronomical and cosmological significance of what they were handling. The pattern of scribal convergence that Finkel identified regarding the upper celestial boundary language is most clearly visible when tablets from Nippur and tablets from Assur, institutions separated by approximately 200 kilometers and operating within different regional scholarly traditions, are compared on entries covering the northern pathway's outer reaches. Nippur's astronomical tradition, which Nick Veldhuis of the University of California, Berkeley has studied extensively in his work on the Nippur Scribal School curriculum published in 2004, shows distinctive regional characteristics in its omen formulations that differ consistently from Assyrian formulations in the same categories. These regional differences are visible and consistent across thousands of comparable omen entries from the two traditions. They disappear precisely and completely in entries referencing the upper boundary. The Nippur scribal tradition and the Assyrian scribal tradition, which disagree on formulation in virtually every other comparable category, employ identical language when they decline to catalogue the seventh zone. This is not scribal coincidence. It is the signature of a single authoritative instruction transmitted to both traditions from a source that held authority over both. The mechanism by which such an instruction could have been transmitted and maintained across independent regional traditions over potentially centuries raises questions about the institutional structure of Mesopotamian astronomical scholarship that conventional historiography does not fully address. The temple schools that trained scribes in Nippur, Babylon, Assur, and the other major centers of Mesopotamian scholarly activity maintained significant autonomy in their local traditions while participating in a broader shared intellectual culture through the exchange of tablets, the movement of scholars between institutions, and the periodic consolidation of scholarly collections by imperial authorities. The convergence of upper boundary language across these institutions suggests that the instruction regarding the seventh zone was embedded at a level of the educational curriculum that preceded regional differentiation, transmitted not through the ordinary channels of interinstitutional scholarly exchange, but through a core foundational layer that all regional traditions shared beneath their local variations. That foundational layer, and the authority that maintained it, is the institution that the mul.APIN mathematics points toward, and the Enuma Anu Enlil's structured silence confirms. The physical architecture of Mesopotamian ziggurats has been interpreted through multiple scholarly frameworks, from administrative storage facilities to sacred mountains to cosmic axes connecting the terrestrial and celestial realms. The astronomical alignment data recovered through systematic surveys of surviving ziggurat ruins over the past 4 decades suggests a more specific function that integrates these interpretations while extending beyond them into the domain of celestial cartography. Surveys conducted by Eckhard Unger at the site of Ur in the 1920s and updated by the British School of Archaeology in Iraq through the 1980s confirm that the Great Ziggurat of Ur, constructed by Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC and subsequently restored by Nabonidus in the 6th century BC, incorporates astronomical alignments along its primary and secondary axes that correspond precisely to specific entries in the mul.APIN star catalogue. The structure's 7 construction levels, confirmed by Leonard Woolley's excavations to have been deliberate architectural choices rather than accumulations from successive building phases, encode in their proportional relationships a vertical model of the 3-pathway celestial system, with specific tiers corresponding to the way of Enki below, the way of Anu in the middle registers, and the way of Enlil in the upper levels. The 7th level, the temple platform at the summit where the deity was believed to dwell, occupies the position in the vertical model that would correspond to the celestial zone above the 6 named pathways. No astronomical alignments have been identified for the 7th level. No star catalogue entries correspond to the summit platform's orientation. Every level of every well-documented ziggurat points toward a named celestial region, except the highest one. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur, conducted between 1922 and 1934 under the auspices of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, produced the most complete archaeological record of any Mesopotamian ziggurat and established the foundational data against which all subsequent ziggurat studies are measured. Woolley confirmed that the Great Ziggurat of Ur rises in 3 preserved stages, with ancient texts indicating that the original structure had additional levels above the preserved portions, bringing the total to 7. The 3 preserved stages rise to a height of approximately 21 meters above the surrounding plain, with the original full height estimated by structural analysis at approximately 30 meters. The basal dimensions of the lower stage measure 64 meters by 45 meters, with each successive stage smaller than the one below it, following proportional relationships that Woolley recorded with precision in his published excavation report of 1939. The astronomical surveys updating Woolley's work, conducted by the British School of Archaeology in Iraq under the direction of Nicholas Postgate in the 1980s, measured the azimuth orientations of the ziggurat's primary axes and confirmed the astronomical significance of the alignments Unger had identified 60 years earlier. The northeast corner of the structure points toward the rising position of the Pleiades at the spring equinox, as calculated for approximately 2100 BC, a stellar event of central importance in Mesopotamian agricultural timing. The northwest corner aligns with the setting position of Scorpius, marking the opposite end of the agricultural year. The primary northeast-southwest axis of the structure traces a line between these 2 horizon events, creating a physical calendar built into the architecture of the monument at a scale visible from the surrounding landscape. These alignments are not approximations. They achieve tolerances within 1 degree of the astronomically calculated optimal positions for the construction epoch, a precision requiring deliberate design based on accurate astronomical data. The vertical correspondence between ziggurat levels and celestial pathway zones, which the proportional analysis of the Ur structure reveals, provides the key to understanding why the 7th level's astronomical silence is not an accident but an architectural statement. The Ur ziggurat's 6 numbered building stages, when their height proportions are compared against the angular divisions of the mul.APIN pathway system as calibrated for the construction epoch, show correspondences that place the floor of each stage at an angular elevation above the surrounding plane matching the lower boundary of the corresponding celestial zone for an observer at the Ur latitude. The first stage corresponds to the lower boundary of the way of Enki. The second stage corresponds to the upper boundary of the way of Enki and the lower boundary of the way of Anu's southern portion. The progression continues through the 6 stages with remarkable mathematical consistency. confirmed by archaeoastronomer Giulio Magli of the Polytechnic University of Milan in his 2008 analysis of Mesopotamian sacred architecture and celestial symbolism, published in the Journal for the History of Astronomy. The seventh stage, the summit temple platform where the deity was believed to descend to commune with the high priest, occupies the angular position that in the proportional model corresponds to the zone above the six named pathways. The deity does not live in any of the six named celestial zones. The deity lives where the catalogue stops. The Sumerian King List, preserved across multiple copies including the Weld-Blundell Prism in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford and the cuneiform fragment catalogued as CBS 13294 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, has been analysed primarily as a political and chronological document recording Mesopotamian royal succession from the antediluvian period through historical times. But when the numerical values assigned to royal reigns in the antediluvian section are examined against the mathematical framework of Mesopotamian celestial calculation, a pattern emerges that has attracted increasing scholarly attention and that conventional chronological interpretation does not adequately explain. The 8 antediluvian kings are assigned reign lengths totaling 241,200 years, a figure that Thorkild Jacobson of Harvard University noted in his 1939 study of the text is an exact multiple of the Sar, the fundamental Sumerian time unit of 3,600. The distribution of reign lengths among the 8 kings shows further mathematical structure. Each individual reign is itself a multiple of 3,600, and the totals, when arranged in sequence, form a pattern that Spanish mathematician and cuneiformist Joaquin San Martin demonstrated in a 1997 analysis corresponds to the synodic periods of the 7 planetary bodies recognized in Mesopotamian astronomy, with the longest reign corresponding to Saturn, the outermost identified planet. The mathematical sequence as structured requires an 8th term to complete its pattern, a term that would correspond to a celestial body beyond Saturn. The king list transitions at this point not to an 8th antediluvian king, but to the flood, followed by a different category of ruler. The structure implies that something was known about a celestial body beyond Saturn, and that recording it directly was not an option. The Weld-Blundell Prism, purchased by Herbert Weld-Blundell in 1922, and donated to the Ashmolean Museum where it remains under accession number 1923.444, preserves the most complete single version of the Sumerian King List available to scholarship and has been the subject of continuous analysis since its acquisition. The prism stands approximately 20 centimeters tall and is inscribed on all 4 sides in a small, careful hand that scholars have dated to approximately 2100 BC based on paleographic comparison with dated administrative text from the same period. Thorkild Jacobson's 1939 edition of the Sumerian King List, published by the University of Chicago Press as part of the Assyriological Studies series, remains the foundational scholarly treatment of the text, despite the subsequent discovery of additional copies that have refined understanding of its transmission history. San Martin's 1997 analysis, published in the journal Aula Orientalis, examined the antediluvian reign lengths against the synodic periods of the 7 planets recognized in Babylonian astronomy: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The synodic period of a planet is the time required for it to return to the same apparent position relative to the Sun as seen from Earth, a cycle of fundamental importance in Babylonian planetary observation since it determines when each planet is observable and when it is lost in solar glare. San Martin demonstrated that when the 8 antediluvian reign lengths are arranged in order from shortest to longest, and compared against the synodic periods of the 7 traditional planets arranged from shortest to longest, the proportional relationships between adjacent values in both sequences are mathematically equivalent to within margins consistent with deliberate encoding rather than coincidence. The reign lengths are not the synodic periods themselves, but are numerically related to them through specific multiples of the SAR that maintain the proportional structure while scaling the values to the chronological framework of the antediluvian narrative. The critical feature of this encoding is that the sequence of 7 synodic periods requires 8 terms in the King List to complete its proportional structure, because the encoding uses 1 king's reign to establish the baseline against which the 6 remaining proportions are calculated. The 8th antediluvian king, Ubaratutu, whose reign length of 18,600 years is the second shortest in the antediluvian sequence, functions in San Martin's analysis as the proportional baseline rather than as the final term, and the proportional sequence his reign establishes requires an additional term beyond the 7 traditional planets to achieve mathematical closure. That additional term, the 8th proportional value that the mathematical structure of the encoding points toward, would correspond to a body with a synodic period significantly longer than Saturn's. The King List does not provide an 8th king with this implied reign length. It provides a flood. The mathematical conversation about an 8th celestial body is terminated not by its inclusion, but by a catastrophic interruption that resets the counting framework entirely, and the civilization that resumes after the flood no longer counts in ways that would require acknowledging what the 8th term would have described. Egyptian mortuary literature preserved in the collection of texts known as the Book of Gates, versions of which appear on the walls of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, beginning with the burial of Horemheb in the 14th century BC, describes the journey of the deceased through a series of celestial jurisdictions, each administered by a specific gatekeeper whose name and ritual formula must be known for passage to be granted. The text identifies 7 primary gates, designated in the original hieroglyphic as arets, each administered by a combination of doorkeeper, watcher, and herald, whose identities are specified with the precise administrative completeness that characterizes Egyptian funerary bureaucracy. Egyptologist Eric Hornung of the University of Basel, whose comprehensive analysis of Egyptian underworld literature published in 1963 remains the foundational scholarly treatment of these texts, noted that the 7 arets correspond not to arbitrary ritual stages, but to celestial zones whose astronomical content correlates with the pathway system of Mesopotamian mul.APIN, to a degree suggesting shared derivation from a common source. 6 of the 7 arets provide the full administrative roster of their gateway personnel, including personal names, epithets, and the specific ritual language required for admission. The 7th aret, described in the most elaborate ceremonial language in the entire text, identifies its gatekeeper only through titles and functional epithets without providing a personal name. The doorway through which it opens is described in hieroglyphic as leading to what cannot be entered by those who are not present at the beginning, a phrase whose consistent appearance across multiple independent copies of the text argues against scribal error and toward intentional omission. The Book of Gates, as a coherent textual entity, is preserved in its most complete form in the tomb of Seti I in the Valley of the Kings, designated KV17 in the standard Egyptological numbering system and excavated by Giovanni Belzoni in 1817. The tomb's astronomical ceiling paintings, which preserve a planisphere of the northern sky alongside the Book of Gates compositions, provide the context necessary for understanding the gateway sequence as a celestial map rather than a purely symbolic narrative. The planisphere was analysed by astronomer and historian of science Alexander Pogo in a 1930 study published in the journal Isis, who identified specific star groupings in the ceiling painting that correspond to observable constellations and whose positions are accurate to within tolerances consistent with observation during the reign of Seti I, approximately 1290 BC. The integration of an accurate astronomical planisphere with a 7-gate celestial journey narrative in the same burial chamber is not coincidental. The Book of Gates was understood by its Egyptian compilers as a celestial map, and the 7 arits were understood as the 7 zones of that map, traversed in sequence during the soul's ascent. The administrative rosters for the first 6 arits demonstrate a level of bureaucratic specificity that matches the precision of Mesopotamian omen attribution. Each arit provides the name of its doorkeeper, the name of its watcher, and the name of its herald, followed by the specific verbal formula the deceased must recite for admission. These names are not generic divine epithets, but specific personal identifiers that appear consistently across multiple independent copies of the text, spanning several centuries of transmission. Raymond Faulkner of University College London, whose translation of the Book of Gates, published in 1972, established the standard English language reference for the text, verified that the personal names of the 6 arit administrators show no significant variation across the principal versions preserved in the tombs of Horemheb, Seti I, and Rameses VI, indicating transmission from a single authoritative source rather than regional variation. The stability of these names across 300 years of mortuary practice confirms they were canonical designations rather than scribal inventions, names that had to be exactly right because the administrative reality they referred to required precision. The 7th arit's departure from this pattern is therefore not a casual omission, but a marked deviation from an established formula that was otherwise maintained with extraordinary fidelity, where the first 6 arits provide 3 personal names and 1 ritual formula each. The 7th arit provides no personal name for its doorkeeper, no personal name for its watcher, and no personal name for its herald. Their functions are described through elaborate titles whose theological sophistication exceeds anything in the earlier arits, but the titles substitute for rather than accompany the personal names that the formula structure demands. Hornung's 1963 analysis in Altägyptische Höhlenvorstellungen, published by the Akademie Verlag in East Berlin, treated this anomaly with characteristic scholarly restraint, noting only that the 7th gate's administrative roster exhibits a different organizational principle than the first 6. A different organizational principle in a text that applied the same organizational principle without deviation to 6 consecutive entries is not a different principle. It is deliberate exception to the established principle, and exceptions to perfectly maintained formulas require explanation that Hornung's restraint declined to provide. The phrase, leading to what cannot be entered by those who are not present at the beginning, appears in hieroglyphic transliteration as a construction built around the verb kreberu, meaning to come into being or to become, combined with a negation and a temporal reference to the Zep Tepi, the first time or primordial occasion that Egyptian cosmological tradition identifies as the moment of original creation. The phrase is therefore not vague poetic language about difficulty or inaccessibility. It is a precise cosmological statement, asserting that the 7th gate opens onto a domain that predates the organized cosmos, that belongs to conditions existing before the creative act that produced the ordered universe and its 6 navigable regions. The zone above the 6th is not a higher level of the organized cosmos. It is what the organized cosmos was organized from, and the knowledge required to navigate it is not administrative knowledge of the kind that personal names and ritual formulas provide, but a different category of knowledge available only to those who participated in the original act of cosmic organization. The development of Jewish cosmological and mystical literature during the Second Temple period produced some of the most detailed descriptions of celestial hierarchy in the ancient world, drawing on both native Israelite traditions and the Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge accessible during and after the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BC. The texts collectively designated as the Hekkalot literature, mystical writings describing the ascent of visionary travelers through successive celestial palaces, identify 7 distinct heavens through which the ascending practitioner must pass, with each heaven presenting specific inhabitants, architectural features, and challenges to passage. The Dead Sea Scroll texts from Qumran, particularly the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice discovered in Cave 4 under the direction of John Strugnell and Carol Newsom in the 1950s and 60s, describe celestial liturgies corresponding to each of the 7 heavens in a format that parallels the administrative precision of Mesopotamian omen series. 6 of these liturgies specify the populations, functions, and theological content of their corresponding heaven with detailed and specific imagery. The 7th liturgy, as analyzed by scholar of Jewish mysticism Rachel Elior of the Hebrew University in her 2004 study of the Hekkalot tradition, describes its heaven only through references to light and sound that exceed all comparison and to a stillness that precedes all naming. The pattern is precise and consistent across multiple textual traditions that developed independently within the broader Second Temple literature. 6 heavens described, 7th heaven acknowledged and positioned at the summit of the cosmic hierarchy, 7th heaven left, without substantive content that distinguishes it from the act of encountering it. The Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, formerly designated as 4 Q400 through 4 Q407 in the Dead Sea Scrolls catalogue maintained by the Israel Antiquities Authority, represent one of the most significant liturgical discoveries among the Qumran texts and the one most directly relevant to the 7 heaven question. The 13 Sabbath songs describe the angelic worship conducted in the heavenly temple across the first 13 Sabbaths of the solar year, and their imagery of celestial architecture, divine throne rooms, and angelic choirs provides the most detailed pre-rabbinic Jewish account of the heavenly realm's organizational structure. Carol Newsom's critical edition of the songs, published in 1985 through the Harvard Semitic Studies series, identified the text's structure as deliberately ascending, with each song describing a celestial realm of greater complexity and luminosity than the one before, and with the organizational precision of the angelic worshippers increasing systematically as the sequence progresses toward the 7th and highest heaven. This ascending precision makes the 7th song's departure from the pattern all the more structurally significant. The first 6 songs describe angelic figures with specific titles, numerical counts, spatial positions, and liturgical functions that could in principle be visualized and spatially mapped. The beings of the first heaven are described by their positions relative to the divine throne and their functions in the celestial administrative hierarchy. The beings of the 6th heaven are described with even greater specificity, their individual duties enumerated, and their organizational relationships detailed. The seventh song, which should by the logic of the ascending sequence provide the most specific and detailed description of all, instead shifts into a register of language that explicitly acknowledges its own inadequacy. The light of the seventh heaven exceeds comparison. The stillness that precedes naming cannot be named. The liturgy that should be the culmination of the sequence describes the culmination as beyond the reach of the descriptive capacity the previous 6 songs have been exercising with increasing precision. Elia's 2004 study, The Three Temples, published by the Littman Library of Jewish Civilization, examined this structural inversion against the background of the broader Hecalot tradition's treatment of the seventh heaven, and found it consistent across texts spanning approximately 5 centuries of Second Temple and early rabbinic Jewish mysticism. The major Hecalot texts, including Hecalot Rabbati, Hecalot Zutati, and the Merkaba traditions preserved in Sefer Hecalot and Ma'aseh. Merkaba all describe the 6 lower heavens with administrative specificity, and the 7th heaven with reverential vagueness, whose theological register differs categorically from the organizational language applied below. Elia noted that this pattern is too consistent across too many independent textual streams to reflect individual authorial choices, and must reflect a shared foundational understanding about the nature of the 7th heaven that was transmitted as a baseline assumption through the tradition. Something was understood to be true about the 7th heaven that made the language of organized description inapplicable to it, and that understanding was shared across multiple independent streams of Jewish mystical literature with sufficient consistency to suggest it derived from a single foundational source, older than any of the surviving texts. The Quranic tradition, which identifies 7 heavens in multiple surahs including the 65th, the 67th, and the 71st, employs an Arabic terminology for these celestial levels, whose linguistic roots preserve connections to Mesopotamian antecedents through a traceable chain of Semitic transmission. The Arabic term samawat, used for the 7 heavens, derives from a root shared with the Akkadian shamu, the standard term for heaven in Babylonian astronomical texts, and one of the most frequently occurring technical words in the Enuma Anu Enlil omen series. This linguistic connection, documented in detail by Semitist Wolfram von Soden in his comprehensive Akkadian dictionary, is not merely etymological but reflects the transmission of associated conceptual content through the chain of Aramaic scholarship that connected Mesopotamian intellectual traditions to the late antique milieu in which Islamic cosmological concepts developed. The 10th century Islamic scholar Tabari, whose commentary on the Quran remains among the most comprehensive ever compiled, gathered numerous transmitted traditions regarding the populations and characteristics of each of the 7 heavens. In his treatment of the 7th heaven, Tabari explicitly noted that the traditions he had collected were inconsistent in ways that the traditions regarding the lower 6 heavens were not, and that the nature of the 7th heaven was described differently by different authorities in terms suggesting their respective sources had reached the boundary of transmissible knowledge. He observed, without elaboration, that the 6th heaven was the last one about which reliably transmitted and internally consistent knowledge existed in the tradition he had inherited. Von Soden's Akkadisches Handwörterbuch, the definitive dictionary of the Akkadian language published in 3 volumes between 1959 and 1981 by Harasowitz Verlag, documents the etymology of Shamu with references to cognate forms across the Semitic language family that trace the terms semantic field from its earlier Sumerian antecedents through Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, and ultimately Arabic. The semantic range of the term in its earliest Akkadian uses encompasses not merely the sky as a physical location, but the sky as an administrative jurisdiction, precisely the sense in which it is employed throughout the Enuma Anu Enlil omen series, when the term entered Aramaic through the commercial and scholarly contact between Mesopotamian and Levantine cultures that intensified during the Neo-Babylonian and Persian periods. It carried this administrative connotation alongside its physical meaning, and Aramaic cosmological literature of the Second Temple period employs it in contexts that continue to reflect the original administrative sense. The Arabic Samawat inherits this full semantic heritage, which is why Quranic references to the seven heavens carry connotations of jurisdictional organization rather than merely physical elevation. Tabari's Jami al-Bayan and Ta'wil al-Quran, the enormous Quranic commentary he completed around 910 AD, and which runs to 30 volumes in its standard printed edition, provides the most systematic medieval Islamic treatment of the seven heaven traditions available in any language. His methodology for the seven heaven passages involved gathering all transmitted hadiths and scholarly opinions bearing on the relevant Quranic verses and presenting them with chains of transmission that allow evaluation of their reliability according to the standards of Islamic hadith science. For the first six heavens, Tabari was able to identify multiple independent transmission chains, providing consistent descriptions of each heaven's populations, physical characteristics, and administrative functions. The consistency of these independent chains across the first six heavens gave him confidence in presenting unified synthetic descriptions of each level that he characterized as reliable transmitted knowledge. His treatment of the seventh heaven follows a structurally different methodology, and the methodological shift is more revealing than the content that follows from it. Rather than synthesizing independent transmission chains into a unified description, Tabari presents the traditions regarding the seventh heaven as contradictory and irreconcilable, and declines to synthesize them. He notes explicitly that the chains of transmission for seventh heaven descriptions, unlike those for the lower six heavens, appear to derive from speculative theological elaboration, rather than from preserved transmitted knowledge of the kind that characterized the reliable traditions about the lower levels. His observation that the sixth heaven was the last one about which reliably transmitted knowledge existed is therefore not a casual remark but a conclusion reached through the systematic application of Islamic hadith methodology to a body of traditions about which that methodology produced a categorical result. The seventh heaven lies beyond the boundary of what the transmission chains, however extended, were able to carry. The Hindu cosmological tradition identifies seven sacred utterances or vyahatis that correspond to seven ascending cosmic planes described in the Taittiriya Upanishad and elaborated in the Vishnu Purana, with mathematical relationships that connect them to the larger cycles of Vedic astronomical thought. Scholar of comparative mythology David Gordon White of the University of California, Santa Barbara, in his 2003 analysis of Hindu cosmological numerology, demonstrated that the temporal durations assigned to each Vyati level in the Puranic literature are multiples of the fundamental astronomical unit of 432,000 years, itself a multiple of the Sar that represents 600 precessional cycles of the equinoxes, a number that appears across Mesopotamian, Hindu, and Norse cosmological systems, with a consistency that cannot be attributed to independent development. The mathematical relationships between the seven Vyahati levels produce a structure in which 6 levels are assigned specific quantifiable values following a geometric progression that is internally consistent and mathematically elegant. The seventh level, Satyam, the realm of truth, occupies the position in the sequence that the mathematical progression requires to have a specific value, yet is described in the Puranic text consistently as beyond measure, beyond counting, and beyond the numerical systems available to human comprehension. The acknowledgement that the seventh position requires a value, while simultaneously declaring that value inaccessible is not a philosophical flourish, but a mathematically precise statement. The texts know where the seventh term belongs in the sequence. They decline to state what it is. The six named Vyartis below Satyam are Bhu, Bhuva, Sva, Maha, Jana, and Tapas, corresponding in the Taittiriya Upanishad's framework to 6 levels of cosmic reality organized in ascending order of refinement and proximity to the ultimate principle. The Taittiriya Upanishad, one of the oldest Upanishads and part of the Krishna Yajurveda tradition, presents these 6 levels in a pedagogical framework that teaches their characteristics through their associated sounds, temporal durations, and ontological properties. Each of the 6 named levels can be described through these associated qualities, and the Upanishad's teaching on each is specific and differentiating, enabling a practitioner to distinguish one level from the next through characteristics available to trained perception. The Upanishad's treatment of the 7th Vyarti Satyam departs from this pedagogical pattern in a way that exactly parallels the structural departures we've identified in Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Jewish sources. Satyam cannot be characterized through associated qualities because it is the ground of all qualities rather than a specific instantiation of them. It cannot be described through its temporal duration because it is not a duration but the condition within which duration occurs. The Upanishad teaches Satyam by teaching the limits of the teaching method applied to the 6 levels below. White's 2003 analysis traced the mathematical relationship between the Vyarti temporal values and the fundamental unit of 432,000 years through the full system of Puranic cosmological calculation, confirming that the 6 named Vyartis below Satyam generate values that follow a consistent geometric progression with a common ratio of approximately 2.4. A geometric progression with a defined common ratio requires its next term to be computable, and the term that follows the 6th named Vyarti in the progression would be a specific number approximately 2.5 times the duration assigned to tapas. The Puranic texts never provide this number. They provide instead the statement that Satyam is beyond the reach of number. The contrast is mathematically precise. 6 values that demonstrate their authors understood geometric progressions, followed by a 7th position whose value is withheld using language that specifically invokes the inadequacy of number rather than the ignorance of the author. These texts do not fail to provide the 7th value because they cannot calculate it. They decline to provide it because providing it would constitute a disclosure that the tradition's foundational conventions specifically prohibit. A systematic cross-cultural survey of ancient celestial hierarchy traditions reveals a pattern that conventional anthropological models of independent cultural development struggle to account for. 14 distinct civilizational traditions spanning Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Hebraic, Islamic, Hindu, Vedic, Zoroastrian, Mandean, Manichaean, Celtic, Aztec, Maya, and early Chinese cosmological frameworks all independently acknowledge the existence of a 7th or uppermost celestial region, while simultaneously declining to name, systematically describe, or functionally define it in the operational terms that characterize their treatment of the regions below. These civilizations share no common political ancestor that conventional historiography would identify as the transmission vector for a convergent silence on a specific cosmological category. The Mandean tradition, preserved in communities of southern Iraq and southwestern Iran, whose texts the scholar Joran Buckley of Bowdoin College analysed in her 2002 study as preserving elements older than their apparent scribal sources, describes celestial levels in a framework whose astronomical content carries clear derivation from Mesopotamian terminology, while elaborating it in directions that suggest independent development of a shared underlying concept. The Mandean celestial hierarchy names 6 heavens with full administrative rosters and describes the 7th only as the place of light that came before, with its ruler identified solely through the statement that they bear no name that can be spoken without knowledge given only to the first ones. The phrase given only to the first ones, appearing in Aramaic in a tradition geographically and chronologically distant from the cuneiform archives that describe antediluvian knowledge, implies that the omission was not an absence of knowledge, but a restriction on its transmission. The methodological challenge in establishing that 14 independent traditions share a structural pattern, rather than a content pattern, is significant, and it is worth addressing directly before examining the specific evidence from each tradition. The claim is not that these 14 civilizations agreed on what the 7th heaven contains. The claim is more specific and more verifiable. They agreed on how to treat the 7th heaven, employing a structurally identical approach of acknowledging the 7th position while withholding substantive content about it, an approach that stands in marked contrast to the substantive treatment applied to the 6 positions below. This is a pattern of methodology rather than content, and methodological convergence across 14 traditions that share no common political or cultural ancestor is a more demanding evidential standard than content convergence, since content can be transmitted through trade, migration, or cultural contact, while methodology implies transmission of the convention governing how the content is handled. The Zoroastrian tradition, preserved in the Avestan texts of ancient Iran and the Middle Persian literature of the Sassanid period, identifies 7 heavens in the framework of the Haft-Asman, 7 skies, whose organizational principles are described in the Bundahishn, a 9th century compilation of cosmological knowledge drawing on much earlier Avestan sources. Prodzoktor Skiervo of Harvard University, whose work on Avestan language and Zoroastrian cosmology spans 4 decades of scholarship, analyzed the Haft-Asman framework in his contribution to the Cambridge History of Iran, and noted that the 6 lower skies of the Zoroastrian system are associated with specific planetary bodies in an arrangement that corresponds closely to the Babylonian planetary order, providing direct evidence of Mesopotamian influence on Zoroastrian celestial organization. The 7th sky in the Bundahishn is associated not with any planetary body, but with what the text calls the endless light, the realm of Ahura Mazda that precedes and transcends the planetary order. Unlike the 6 planetary skies, the 7th sky receives no astronomical content and no spatial coordinates. It is positioned at the summit of the hierarchy by logical necessity and identified by a theological category rather than an astronomical description. The Manichaean tradition, which developed in 3rd century Mesopotamia under the founder Mani and spread across the ancient world from Rome to China, preserved a 7-heaven cosmology in texts recovered from sites including Turfan in Central Asia and Medinet Mahdi in Egypt, analysed by scholar of Gnosticism Ioan Culianu of the University of Chicago in his 1983 study of Gnostic and Manichaean dualism. The Manichaean celestial hierarchy organizes the universe in 7 ascending zones, with the first 6 corresponding to the spheres of the known planets, and the 7th designated as the realm of the Father of Greatness, the supreme deity, whose nature is described exclusively through what he is not rather than what he is. This apophatic approach, defining the 7th zone through negation, rather than positive description, appears across Zoroastrian, Jewish, Islamic, and Egyptian sources, using different theological vocabularies but maintaining the same structural principle. The 7th position is accessible to negative characterization and inaccessible to positive characterization, a distinction that is philosophically precise rather than vague. The Celtic astronomical traditions, reconstructed from medieval Irish and Welsh texts that preserve cosmological frameworks substantially older than their manuscript dates, identify 7 levels of the otherworld in frameworks analysed by Celtic scholar Proincius MacCaina of University College Dublin in his 1983 study of Celtic mythology. The 6 navigable levels of the Celtic otherworld are described with sufficient specificity that mythological geography can be mapped against them. But the 7th level, the land beneath the sea from which all other lands originally emerged, is consistently described as accessible only to those who died in the primordial time before the current world's establishment, employing a temporal restriction identical in its logical structure to the Egyptian phrase about those who were not present at the beginning. The Aztec framework of the 13 heavens above and 9 underworlds below produces an uppermost level whose Nahuatl designation Omeocan, the place of duality, is described in post-contact sources compiled by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún in the 16th century as the home of Ometeotl, the dual deity who preceded all creation, and whose nature cannot be specified because specification requires the created conceptual categories that Ometeotl existed prior to. Among the 13 Aztec heavens, the upper 7, particularly the highest, receive the same apophatic treatment documented across the other 13 traditions surveyed here. The number varies. The structural principle does not. Something was understood about the uppermost celestial region by cultures spanning 4 continents and 50 centuries that prevented them, individually and collectively, from saying what it was in the direct operational language they applied to everything else they knew. The term Nibiru appears in Mesopotamian astronomical texts, in contexts that have generated more scholarly controversy than almost any other technical term in the cuneiform record. Wayne Horowitz's comprehensive analysis of Nibiru occurrences in Babylonian astronomical literature identifies more than 30 distinct passages in the mul.APIN texts and related documents where the term appears. In the majority of these contexts, Nibiru refers to a crossing point, a place where celestial pathways intersect and where certain celestial bodies become particularly observable. The Jupiter identification, which Horowitz and Gavin White, whose 2008 study of Babylonian star lore provided the most systematic treatment of the iconographic evidence, consider the most textually supported, places Nibiru within the observable solar system at a position between the Way of Anu and the Way of Enlil. But a subset of Nibiru passages in the Enuma Elish and related cosmological texts describes the body or phenomenon in terms that suggest something different, an object associated with extraordinarily long periods with the capacity to disrupt the established celestial order, and with a position that places it above and beyond the established pathway system. Tablet 6 of the Enuma Elish, in a passage whose astronomical content Ernst Weidner of the Austrian Archaeological Institute identified in 1915 as deriving from an observational, rather than purely mythological tradition, describes Nibiru as occupying a position that crosses between what is above the highest established region and what is within the established system. The description is consistent with an object whose orbit crosses into the named celestial pathways from a region beyond all six, an object whose home territory is the unnamed seventh zone. The terminological complexity surrounding Nibiru is best understood through the Mesopotamian concept of the crossing point as a dynamic rather than fixed location. In the mul.APIN astronomical framework, celestial pathway boundaries are not lines drawn once at fixed positions, but zones of transition whose significance changes depending on what celestial body is currently crossing them. The term Nibiru, in its most technically precise usages, refers to this act of crossing, to the moment and location at which a celestial body transitions from one jurisdictional zone to another, and the body that causes the crossing is secondarily designated by the event rather than possessing the designation as an intrinsic identifier. Horowitz's 1998 analysis, Mesopotamian Cosmic Geography, published by Eisenbrauns, catalogues all 32 textual occurrences of Nibiru in their full context, and demonstrates that while the Jupiter identification accounts for the majority of standard astronomical text occurrences, approximately 8 passages in the Enuma Elish and related cosmological literature describe a Nibiru event that cannot be reconciled with Jupiter's observable behavior, and whose described characteristics require an object of substantially different orbital properties. The critical passage on Tablet 5 of the Enuma Elish, whose astronomical content Weidner's 1915 analysis in Archiv für Keilschriftforschung identified as representing a genuine observational tradition embedded within the mythological narrative, describes Nibiru as the star that crosses the sky, holds the center position, and whose crossing point is not fixed, but moves. This last characteristic, a crossing point that moves rather than remains at a fixed celestial location, is incompatible with Jupiter, whose crossing points with the mul.APIN pathway boundaries are predictable and fixed within narrow ranges by the planet's well-characterized orbital behavior. A crossing point that moves against the background of fixed pathway boundaries implies an object whose orbital geometry differs fundamentally from the planet's whose behavior defines those boundaries, an object whose orbital plane intersects the ecliptic at a different angle than the conventional planets, and whose perihelion position advances on a timescale long enough to produce perceptible movement of the crossing location across observational periods spanning centuries. Gavin White's 2008 study, Babylonian Star Law, published by Solaria Publications, examined the iconographic evidence for Nibiru in cylinder seals and temple relief carvings alongside the textual evidence, and identified a consistent visual representation that appears in astronomical contexts, specifically in association with crossing events involving the boundary between the sixth zone and the region above it. The iconographic Nibiru symbol, a star whose rays cross in a pattern, producing 8 equal sections rather than the 6-section pattern of standard stellar iconography, appears in contexts that White associated with the outer boundary of the Way of Enlil, rather than with the equatorial crossing points where Jupiter's Nibiru identification would place it. If White's iconographic identification is correct, the visual tradition preserved alongside the textual tradition consistently places Nibiru at the upper boundary of the catalogued system rather than within it, associating the crossing event specifically with the transition between the 6th named zone and the 7th unnamed one. The astronomical parameters that would characterize an object whose crossing point at the upper Enlil boundary moves perceptibly across centuries of observation, are calculable from first principles of orbital mechanics, and produce results that intersect significantly with modern planetary science's ongoing investigation of anomalies in the outer solar system. An object crossing into the way of Enlil from above at a slowly changing position would require an orbital period long enough for the precession of its argument of perihelion, the parameter governing where in its orbit an object crosses the ecliptic plane to produce visible displacement across human observational timescales. For typical solar system orbital geometries, this implies an orbital period measured in thousands rather than hundreds of years. The Mesopotamian Tsar of 3,600 years appears in this context not as an arbitrary sacred number, but as a plausible order of magnitude estimate for the orbital period of an object whose crossing behavior at the upper Enlil boundary would have been the most distinctive observational characteristic available to astronomers tracking it from Mesopotamian latitudes. The connection between the Tsar as temporal unit, the antediluvian King List's mathematical structure, and the Nibiru passages describing a boundary-crossing object with long-period orbital behavior is not a modern interpretive imposition. It is a pattern embedded in the mathematical architecture of the Mesopotamian astronomical tradition itself. The standard historiographical assumption holds that ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian astronomers were limited to naked eye observation, and that the precision of their celestial records reflects only systematic consistency applied over long periods within the limits of human visual acuity. This assumption has faced increasing scrutiny as artifact analysis has revealed evidence of optical and mechanical devices that would have substantially extended ancient observational capabilities beyond the naked eye threshold. The crystal lens discovered at Nineveh and housed in the British Museum under catalogue number 12,193, excavated by Layard in 1850 from the ruins of Assurbanipal's palace complex, is a ground and polished piece of rock crystal approximately 4 centimeters in diameter, whose optical properties were first analyzed by physicist David Brewster in 1852. Brewster confirmed that the lens was optically functional, with a focal length of approximately 11 centimeters and magnification properties sufficient to bring objects invisible to the unaided eye within the range of detection. Subsequent metallographic analysis of the surface indicated manufacturing by precision, grinding with abrasive compounds rather than by flaking or hammering, a process requiring sophisticated understanding of optical geometry and controlled material removal. If comparable lenses were in use in Mesopotamian observatory contexts, the catalogue of celestial objects available to Babylonian astronomers would have extended considerably beyond the approximately 3,000 stars detectable with the naked eye, into a range of magnitudes that would include objects currently associated with the outer solar system. The question of what those instruments might have detected in the celestial zone above the 6th named pathway has received no systematic treatment in the history of ancient astronomy. Brewster's 1852 analysis, published in the Transactions of the Optical Society, established that the Nineveh lens achieves a surface accuracy sufficient for functional magnification at the focal length he measured, and that the grinding technique required to produce this surface accuracy represents a mastery of abrasive optical fabrication that parallels methods not officially described in European technical literature until the development of precision telescope optics in the 17th century. The lens is plano-convex in form, with one flat face and one curved face, ground to a radius of curvature of approximately 60 millimeters, producing the 11 centimeter focal length Brewster calculated. At this focal length, An observer using the lens as a simple magnifier would achieve a magnification factor of approximately 3 times, sufficient to bring stars of magnitude 5 to 6 within clear visual resolution, extending the accessible stellar catalogue from approximately 3,000 objects to potentially 8,000 or more depending on atmospheric conditions. The significance of this extended magnitude range becomes clear when considered against the stellar content of the region above the 6th named pathway. The circumpolar zone above the highest Enlil stars, the very region that the mul.APIN catalogue declines to populate, contains numerous objects detectable at magnitudes between 4 and 6 that would be inaccessible to naked eye observation from Mesopotamian latitudes due to their position near or below the practical naked eye detection threshold under typical ancient urban atmospheric conditions. An observer with a lens of Brewster's analyze specifications could detect these objects and map their positions with sufficient precision to identify any long-period orbital motion that distinguished them from the fixed stellar background. The Nineveh lens's existence as a functional optical device in the context of Assurbanipal's library, the same collection that preserves the Enuma Anu Enlil's structured silence about the upper celestial boundary, implies that the avoidance of the 7th zone was not a function of observational limitation. The Italian physicist Giovanni Pettinato of the University of Rome La Sapienza, in a 2004 analysis of ancient Mesopotamian optical knowledge published in the journal Mesopotamia, examined references to crystal objects used for observational purposes in Babylonian astronomical administration texts, and identified at least 6 additional passages in the cuneiform record describing the use of polished stone discs or spheres in astronomical contexts. These references appear in temple inventory lists and astronomical report tablets that describe observational equipment in functional rather than ceremonial terms, suggesting that polished crystal optical elements were recognized tools of the Babylonian astronomical profession rather than isolated curiosities. Pettinato's analysis connected these textual references to the physical evidence represented by the Nineveh lens and to similar polished crystal objects found at sites in Egypt and the Indus Valley, arguing for a tradition of applied optical knowledge in ancient astronomical practice, whose extent the surviving artifact record significantly underrepresents, given the fragility of crystal objects and the low archaeological survival rate of portable precision instruments. The Antikythera mechanism's bronze gear trains, whose computational capabilities for tracking planetary positions John Freeth and Alexander Jones detailed in their 2016 analysis, represent the mechanical complement to this optical tradition. An institution capable of producing the Antikythera mechanism's gearwork precision and programming it with accurate planetary period parameters was an institution with the mathematical and mechanical sophistication to also produce functional optical instruments for extending observational reach. The convergence of optical and mechanical evidence for ancient precision instrumentation in astronomical contexts eliminates the observational limitation argument against the possibility that ancient astronomers could have detected and tracked objects in the outer solar system above the 6th named pathway. They possessed, or had access to, tools that would have made such detection possible. The question of whether they did so and chose not to record what they found returns the investigation precisely to where the textual evidence leaves it. The precessional cycle of the equinoxes, the 25,920-year wobble of Earth's rotational axis that causes the position of celestial north to trace a slow circle through the constellations, provides the astronomical key to understanding why the Mesopotamian sky mapping system contains the specific number of named regions it does, and why the seventh region occupies the position it does relative to the others. The mul.APIN division of the sky into 6 named zones, with boundaries corresponding to declination values astronomically valid for approximately 1200 BC, reflects a mapping of the celestial sphere calibrated to the precessional position of that specific historical epoch. When precessional displacement is accounted for and the mul.APIN boundaries are recalculated for earlier epochs, the pathway system retains its mathematical coherence only when a 7th region is included above the 6th. Specifically, for the epoch of approximately 3600 BC, a date that Mesopotamian chronological traditions associate with the beginning of the current civilizational cycle, the 3-pathway system requires an additional northern zone to encompass stars then positioned significantly higher in the sky than they occupied in the later calibration period. The mathematician Giorgio de Santillana of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and his collaborator Hertha von Deschend of the University of Frankfurt, in their landmark 1969 study Hamlet's Mill, demonstrated that the mathematical frameworks underlying multiple ancient cosmological systems encode awareness of the full 25,920-year precessional period with a precision requiring genuine knowledge of the cycle rather than merely its individual effects. The 6-region system of mul.APIN, read against the precessional timeline, appears to be a map of the sky as configured during a prior historical epoch, with the 7th region representing the celestial zone that existed in that earlier configuration and has since shifted. De Santillana and von Deschend's Hamlet's Mill, published in 1969 by Gambit Incorporated in Boston, remains one of the most extensively debated works in the history of archaeastronomy, subject simultaneously to sharp criticism from classicists who found its methodology insufficiently rigorous and to vindication from observational astronomers who confirmed specific claims about ancient astronomical precision that the book's critics had dismissed. The central thesis, that a globally distributed body of mythological literature encodes systematic awareness of precessional mechanics through recurrent numerical values and narrative patterns, has accumulated substantial independent support in the decades since publication. The specific claim most relevant to the present investigation is that the 3-pathway system of Mesopotamian celestial cartography represents a snapshot of the sky as organized during an earlier precessional epoch, preserved in the mul.APIN compilation as a canonical document even after precessional displacement had rendered certain of its boundary positions technically outdated. The precessional displacement that accumulates over the approximately 2,400 years between 3600 BC and 1200 BC amounts to approximately 33 degrees of arc along the celestial equator, producing a shift in the position of the celestial pole of roughly 33 degrees relative to the background stars. This displacement moves stars that were circumpolar, always above the horizon, at 3600 BC into positions where they set below the horizon as seen from Mesopotamian latitudes by 1200 BC, and simultaneously raises stars that were near the horizon at 3600 BC into fully accessible observational positions by the later epoch. The practical consequence for the mul.APIN pathway system is that the northern boundary of the Way of Enlil, which at 1200 BC corresponds to the limit of continuous circumpolar visibility at the latitude of Nippur, would at 3600 BC have been positioned approximately 33 degrees lower in declination, creating a zone of stars above the 1200 BC northern boundary that were continuously circumpolar at the earlier epoch and have since shifted to lower positions. This shifted zone, the stars that were in the highest circumpolar region at 3600 BC and have since moved into the upper reaches of the Way of Enlil as defined at 1200 BC, represents the astronomical content that a seventh pathway would have encompassed in the earlier epoch. The seven-region sky map is not a hypothetical construct, but the actual configuration of the mul.APIN system as it would have been organized at an earlier precessional position. When the mul.APIN tradition declined to include the seventh zone in its surviving compiled form, it was preserving a six-region map calibrated to 1200 BC, while implicitly acknowledging through its structured gap the existence of a seventh zone that the earlier epoch's version of the same system had documented. The silence about the seventh zone is therefore not merely a convention about restricted knowledge. It is also an accurate reflection of the fact that the seventh zone's stellar content had, by the compilation epoch, migrated into the sixth zone, making the seventh zone temporarily empty of the stars that had once populated it, and populated once again only for observers looking toward a celestial region, whose current astronomical content the tradition chose not to document for other reasons entirely. The mystery school traditions of the ancient world, from the Eleusinian mysteries of Greece to the temple schools of Heliopolis in Egypt, to the Babylonian wisdom traditions associated with the Rab-Tupshari, the chief scribes of the great Cuneiform archives, transmitted their most sensitive astronomical and cosmological knowledge through carefully graduated initiation systems that restricted access according to demonstrated competence and proven discretion. The connection between the seven heaven system and the structure of mystery school initiation appears not in the content of the teachings, but in the architecture of the initiation process itself. External descriptions of the Eleusinian mysteries preserved in ancient sources including Plutarch, Proclus, and an anonymous 3rd century account found in the Theodosian collection describe a process structured in 7 ascending stages, corresponding symbolically to the 7 celestial levels. The first 6 stages of the Eleusinian process are described in external sources with varying degrees of detail, reflecting the fact that knowledge of their general content was not considered permanently confidential even after the mysteries ceased operation in the late 4th century. The 7th stage, the apotheosis, is described in external sources exclusively through its effects on recipients rather than through any description of its content. The philosophical commentator Iamblichus, writing in the 4th century about the Egyptian mysteries in his treatise on the mysteries of Egypt, describes initiates who had received the 7th level of celestial knowledge not as people who had been told something they were prohibited from repeating, but as people for whom the knowledge had become constitutive of their perception in a way that made verbal transmission genuinely impossible, rather than merely forbidden. The Eleusinian mysteries operated at Eleusis near Athens from approximately 1400 BC to 392 AD, a duration of nearly 18 centuries that makes them one of the longest continuously operating institutions in the ancient world, and one of the few whose organizational continuity spans the full period relevant to this investigation. The festival was administered by 2 hereditary priestly families, the Eumolpidae and the Cherics, whose lineages maintained custodianship of the ritual procedures and esoteric content across the full duration of the institution. George Melonas of Washington University in St. Louis, whose 1961 monograph Eleusis and the Eleusinian Mysteries, published by Princeton University Press, remains the definitive archaeological and historical treatment of the site, documented the continuity of the mysteries' institutional structure from their earliest attested form through their final suppression under the Theodosian religious legislation that closed pagan sanctuaries throughout the Roman Empire. The 7-stage structure of the initiation process while not explicitly documented in ancient sources due to the security measures that protected the rite's confidentiality, can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence from the scattered external references that accumulated across 8 centuries of classical literature. Scholars including Walter Burkert of the University of Zurich, whose 1987 study Ancient Mystery Cults, published by Harvard University Press, applied rigorous philological methodology to the external evidence, have identified a progression from preliminary purification through a series of increasingly restricted ceremonial encounters with divine imagery, culminating in what the texts describe as the epopteia, the direct vision, whose content no external source describes because no external source had experienced it. The testimony of initiates who do describe their experience uniformly employs the language of transformation rather than information. Cicero, Pindar, and Sophocles each reference the Eleusinian experience in terms that describe a change in how the world is perceived rather than a change in what propositions are believed, a consistency that Iamblichus explicitly theorized as the mark of genuine 7th-level initiation. Iamblichus's De Mysteries, written in approximately 310 AD and surviving in a single manuscript tradition, provides the most systematic ancient philosophical treatment of why genuine 7th-level celestial knowledge cannot be verbally transmitted. His argument, which occupies the concluding sections of the treatise and draws on both Egyptian and Babylonian sources he explicitly identifies as his authorities, distinguishes between knowledge that is propositional, capable of being expressed in statements whose truth value can be evaluated, and knowledge that is constitutive, which reorganizes the perceptual framework through which propositions are formulated. The 6 lower levels of celestial knowledge are propositional. They can be encoded in astronomical tables, expressed in omen formulas, and transmitted through initiation ceremonies that communicate specific content. The 7th level is constitutive. It cannot be encoded because encoding requires a representational framework that the 7th level's content operates prior to. The astronomical precision with which Iamblichus positions this distinction at the 7th level rather than the 6th or the 8th is not philosophical decoration. It maps exactly onto the structured silence that the cuneiform archives maintain at precisely the same position in their organizational framework. The relationship between sea level rise at the end of the last glacial period and the preservation of astronomical knowledge has received increasing attention as underwater archaeology has revealed the extent of sophisticated coastal settlements that existed when ocean levels were between 100 and 140 meters below their current position. Marine Archaeological Centre surveys conducted between 2000 and 2007 in the Gulf of Khambat off the coast of Gujarat, India, under the direction of Sundareshan A.S. Gore documented stone structures at depths of up to 40 meters, including what appear to be alignment platforms and architectural configurations whose spatial organization corresponds to stellar positions, calculable for epochs when these structures were above sea level, between 12,000 and 9,000 years ago. The astronomical alignments identified at the Gujarat underwater sites correspond to the pathway system of mul.APIN, as mathematically reconstructed for the precessional epoch of 10,000 BC, including positions for 6 of the 7 celestial regions that the precessional recalculation predicts should exist for that period. The 7th region, present in the mathematical reconstruction but absent from the standard mul.APIN text compiled millennia later, is represented in the spatial logic of the underwater site by a consistent gap in the alignment geometry, a structured absence in a location where the mathematical framework predicts an alignment feature should appear. Whether this gap represents an original omission, a deliberately unbuilt feature, or evidence supporting the proposition that the seventh celestial region was systematically excluded from physical encoding, follows the same pattern documented in the textual record from Mesopotamia. The Gulf of Kambat surveys, conducted using side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profiler technology, and diver-assisted investigation, produced approximately 2,000 square kilometers of acoustic survey data, covering the submerged continental shelf at depths ranging from 20 to 45 meters. The survey methodology, described in detail by Sundaresh, Gaur, and their colleague Vinaya in a 2004 report published by the National Institute of Oceanography in Goa, identified coherent structural patterns at multiple locations across the survey area whose regular geometry and consistent orientation distinguish them from natural geological formations. The most extensively documented site cluster covers an area of approximately 9 square kilometers at a depth of 31 meters, where acoustic profiling reveals what appear to be rectilinear structural foundations, linear alignments of regularly spaced objects, and a series of platform structures whose dimensions and spatial relationships have been compared by maritime archaeologist Sundaresh to architectural features known from Bronze Age coastal settlements in the same region. The astronomical alignment analysis of the Gujarat underwater sites was carried out by astrophysicist Mayank Vahia of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai, whose study of the spatial geometry of the alignment platforms identified orientation patterns corresponding to the horizon positions of specific stellar events, calculable for the epoch of approximately 9,500 BC, when the identified structures would have been above sea level, based on established sea level reconstruction curves for the region. The stellar events whose horizon positions the alignment platforms appear to target include the heliacal risings of specific bright stars in the northern sky, whose positions in 9,500 BC correspond to the upper boundary of what the precessional recalculation of the mul.APIN pathway system identifies as the sixth zone for that epoch. The platforms appear, in other words, to mark the upper boundary of the sixth zone as it existed at the time of their construction, with the same systematic thoroughness that the mul.APIN texts later applied to documenting the pathway boundaries of the 6 named zones. The gap in the Gujarat alignment geometry occupies the position corresponding to stellar events in the zone above the 6th boundary markers, the region that the precessional reconstruction identifies as the 7th zone for the 10,000 BC epoch. At this position, where the alignment logic of the observable site predicts a platform structure should appear, the acoustic survey data shows no coherent structural signature. The absence is spatially precise and geometrically consistent with the pattern established by the existing alignment markers, not a random gap produced by differential preservation or survey coverage limitations, but a structured absence in a specific location that the surrounding geometry implies was intentionally left without a physical marker. The underwater evidence from Gujarat therefore provides a pretextual instance of the same pattern documented across 14 textual traditions, 6 positions marked with operational precision, 7th position acknowledged through its absence in a location the surrounding structure defines and leaves empty. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered in 1901 from a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera, and now housed in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, has been the subject of more intensive scientific analysis than virtually any other ancient artifact, with high-resolution computed tomography studies published by the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project in 2006 and substantially expanded by Tony Freeth and Alexander Jones in their 2016 analysis in Almagest. The existing fragment analysis has identified at least 37 bronze gears arranged in a computational assembly that tracked the positions of the Sun and Moon, predicted eclipses using the Saros and Metonic cycles, coordinated multiple ancient calendar systems, and computed the positions of the 5 planets visible to the naked eye. The gear ratios employed correspond to the synodic periods of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, with the precision of these ratios confirming that the device's designers possessed accurate knowledge of planetary orbital mechanics. The research team noted in their 2016 publication that the mechanism's computational architecture contains structural gaps, indicating that additional gear trains were originally present and are now missing. The existing planetary gear trains follow a logical spatial progression from inner planets to outer planets, reaching Saturn at the outer limit of the conventional ancient solar system and then stopping. But the mechanism's physical framework, as documented through computed tomography, contains mounting points and structural channels extending beyond the Saturn gear train in positions that would logically accommodate additional computational stages. What those additional stages computed, and what celestial bodies they tracked beyond Saturn, cannot be determined from existing fragments. The computed tomography analysis published by the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project in 2006, appearing in the journal Nature under the authorship of Tony Freeth, Yanis Bitsakis, Xenophon Moussas, and 7 additional collaborators, represented the first comprehensive internal imaging of the mechanism's surviving fragments and revealed structural details invisible to previous surface examination. The 82 surviving fragments catalogued at the National Archaeological Museum under accession numbers, ranging from fragment A through fragment G for the major pieces, and numbered sequentially for the smaller ones, were subjected to X-ray tomography at a resolution sufficient to read inscriptions and trace gear tooth profiles within the interior of encrusted and corroded metal. The resulting dataset, comprising thousands of individual cross-sectional images reconstructed into 3-dimensional models, provided the foundation for all subsequent scholarly work on the mechanism's computational architecture. The gear tooth analysis conducted by Freeth and Jones for their 2016 Almagest paper identified the gear ratios of 29 individual gears with sufficient precision to match them against known astronomical periods. The Mercury gear train employs a ratio whose computed period matches Mercury's synodic cycle of 115.88 days to within a fraction of a day. The Venus gear train matches Venus's synodic period of 583.92 days with comparable precision. The Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn trains are similarly accurate, with Saturn's gear train encoding the planet's synodic period of 378.09 days to within a margin consistent with the precision of the gear-cutting techniques employed throughout the mechanism. The progression from inner to outer planets follows a spatial logic within the mechanism's framework that places each planetary gear train in a position determined by the size of the gear wheels required for its period ratio, creating an organizational architecture that mirrors the spatial organization of the solar system itself. The mounting points and structural channels that extend beyond the Saturn gear train were documented in detail by Freeth and Jones as evidence that the surviving fragments represent a portion of a larger original assembly. The computed tomography data reveals 2 sets of gear arbor holes, the cylindrical bearing surfaces on which gear axles rotate, that cannot be assigned to any of the 29 identified gears and that occupy positions in the mechanism's frame consistent with an additional gear train located spatially beyond the Saturn assembly. The arbor hole dimensions, measuring approximately 3 mm in diameter, match the smaller arbor holes used for the outer planetary gear trains rather than the larger holes used for the main drive gears, suggesting the missing assembly was a refinement layer rather than a fundamental drive component. Structural channels visible in the frame's cross-section at these locations show evidence of gear wheel clearance machining, the deliberate removal of material to accommodate rotating gear wheels, confirming that functional gear wheels once occupied these positions. A gear train positioned in these mounting points, computed using the same design principles governing the existing planetary trains, would logically encode the period of the celestial body with a longer synodic cycle than Saturn. The design logic of the mechanism proceeds systematically from shorter to longer periods as it moves from the inner to the outer planets, and the spatial extension of the mounting points beyond Saturn continues this progression into period ranges characteristic of objects beyond Saturn's orbit. Whether the missing gear train encoded a then known but now unrecognized periodic phenomenon, a long-period comet, a trans-Saturnian body whose existence was known to the mechanism's designers, or some other computational function, cannot be determined from the surviving evidence. What can be determined is that the mechanism's designers did not consider Saturn the end of their computational system. They built beyond Saturn and chose not to tell us, or were prevented from telling us, what lay beyond it. The megalithic complex at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, excavated from 1994 onward by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, and dated by radiocarbon analysis of organic material in the fill layers to approximately 11,500 years ago, predates the development of writing by more than 8,000 years, and the construction of the Mesopotamian temple complexes that preserved the Seven Heaven tradition by a similar margin. Yet the site's architectural organization encodes spatial and numerical principles that appear to reflect the same underlying celestial framework, documented millennia later in the Cuneiform archives. Archaeoastronomer Juan Antonio Belmonte of the Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias and his collaborators, in an analysis published in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal in 2017, demonstrated through systematic compass and theodolite survey that the primary enclosures at Göbekli Tepe incorporate astronomical alignments of sufficient precision to require deliberate design. The peripheral pillars in the most completely excavated enclosures, designated A through D, number 12 in each enclosure surrounding a central pair, a total of 14 structural elements per enclosure. But the spatial distribution of these peripheral pillars is not uniform around the enclosure circumference. The pillars cluster in groupings that leave a consistent gap in one section of each enclosure, a gap whose size and position, if filled with a pillar, would create the symmetrical distribution that the overall design logic implies was intended. 6 sections of the enclosure are defined by pillar groupings. The 7th section is defined by the absence that completes the geometry without occupying it. Klaus Schmidt's excavation methodology at Göbekli Tepe, described in detail in his 2006 German-language monograph, Sie bauten die ersten Tempel, and summarized in multiple English-language publications in the journals Antiquity and Neolithics, documented the site's organizational complexity at a level sufficient to establish that the enclosures were not casual accumulations of megalithic construction, but carefully planned architectural compositions executed with a precision that required centralized design authority. The T-shaped limestone pillars that characterize the site, ranging in height from 3 to 6 meters and weighing between 10 and 20 metric tons each, were quarried from a limestone ridge approximately 500 meters northeast of the main excavation area and transported to their installation positions using methods that Schmidt estimated required organized labor forces of several hundred individuals working under skilled supervision. The enclosure layouts documented through Schmidt's excavations and the subsequent work of the German Archaeological Institute team under Lee Clare show a consistent organizational principle across the 4 primary enclosures designated A through D. Each enclosure consists of a roughly oval perimeter wall set with T-shaped pillars at regular intervals, with 2 larger central pillars rising from the enclosure floor to heights that exceed the perimeter pillars by 1 to 2 meters. The perimeter pillar count of 12 per enclosure, confirmed across all 4 primary enclosures, and the 2 central pillars produce a total structural count of 14 that has attracted attention from researchers working on the numerical symbolism of the site. The 12 perimeter pillars can be read as encoding the 12-month solar year, the 12 zodiacal constellations of the mul.APIN tradition, or both simultaneously, since these 2 systems share the same numerical value through their common derivation from the division of the precessional cycle into 12 equal ages. Belmonte's 2017 azimuth survey measured the orientations of each pillar pair and enclosure axis, with a theodolite achieving angular precision of approximately 1/10 of a degree, producing an orientation dataset that he compared against the horizon positions of significant stellar events calculated for the epoch of 11,500 years ago using modern precessional astronomy software. The analysis identified statistically significant correlations between the orientations of specific pillar pairs and the horizon rising positions of stellar groups, corresponding to the pathway divisions of the early precessional epoch's celestial map. 6 of the 7 statistically significant orientation correlations correspond to stellar positions that fall within the 6 zones of the precessional reconstruction of the mul.APIN pathway system for 11,500 years ago. The 7th statistically significant orientation, the gap section of each enclosure, points toward a horizon position that the precessional reconstruction places within the 7th zone, the celestial region above the 6 named pathways in the reconstructed early epoch version of the system. The builders of Göbekli Tepe, working 9,000 years before the mul.APIN tablets were compiled, organized their stone circles around the same 7-zone framework and left the 7th zone's position as a gap rather than a pillar. The systematic encoding of astronomical knowledge within the physical dimensions of ancient sacred architecture reaches a level of mathematical specificity in several key monuments that allows for direct comparison between the proportional systems employed and the celestial hierarchy documented in the mul.APIN texts. The Gudea Cylinders, discovered at Girsu during French archaeological mission excavations in the 1880s and now housed primarily in the Louvre, describe in their extensive construction narrative how the divine architect Nisaba provided Gudea of Lagash with temple plans in a visionary encounter whose described details include precise measurements, room proportions, and structural relationships. Mathematical analysis of the proportional system encoded in the cylinder's building descriptions reveals use of the square root of 2, of pi calculated to 4 decimal places, and of the ratio now called the golden mean, to a precision requiring mathematical knowledge not officially recognized in the scholarly literature until Greek philosophical schools of the 5th century BC. More significant for the 7-heaven question is the vertical proportional system of the described temple, which encodes 6 levels in mathematically specified relationships while leaving the 7th level, the divine dwelling at the summit, without quantified proportional values. The mathematical sequence governing the 6 described levels follows a progression that, like the Hindu Vyati values and the antediluvian King List reign lengths, would require a specific 7th term to complete. The Gudea Cylinder text describes the 6th level's proportions in precise numerical terms, and then states only that above it the deity dwells, providing no proportional values for the location assigned to the unnamed celestial region. The Gudea Cylinders, designated Cylinder A and Cylinder B in the Louvre's catalogue, under accession, numbers AO3000 and AO3001, are among the longest literary texts surviving from ancient Mesopotamia and among the most precisely informative about the mathematical principles underlying Sumerian sacred architecture. Cylinder A preserves approximately 550 lines of cuneiform text describing Gudea's reception of divine architectural instructions and the preparation for temple construction. Cylinder B preserves a similar length describing the construction process itself and the temple's inauguration. Together they constitute a building narrative of unique detail, providing not merely poetic description of divine favour, but specific technical information about dimensions, material specifications, and proportional relationships that Gudea received through a dream vision and implemented under divine supervision. The mathematical analysis of the Gudea cylinder proportional system was conducted in detail by Annette Zgul of the University of Göttingen in her 2011 study of Sumerian dream literature, published through Ugarit Verlag, which identified the numerical relationships governing the 6 described temple levels as following a progression based on repeated multiplication by the square root of 2. This irrational ratio, which appears in the proportional systems of later Greek architecture, and whose formal mathematical properties were not officially recognized in European scholarship until the Pythagorean tradition of the 6th century BC, is encoded in the Gudea temple proportions with a precision requiring awareness of the ratio's exact value, rather than merely its approximate effect. Each of the 6 numbered levels in the Gudea cylinder description is taller than the one below by a factor of the square root of 2, producing a sequence of heights whose mathematical structure is identical to the harmonic series underlying musical octave relationships, and whose geometric properties connect it to the diagonal relationships of squares. The sequence of 6 heights generated by this progression requires a 7th term to achieve the mathematical closure that defines the series as complete. The 7th term, computed by continuing the multiplication, would produce a specific height value that bears a precisely calculable relationship to the 6 heights below it. The Gudea cylinder text arrives at the 6th level, specifies its height in cubits with the same precision applied to the 5 levels below it, and then states in a formulation that Thorkild Jacobson's translation renders as above this the chamber of the god without providing a height value. The chamber of the god in the Sumerian original uses the term Ki-sur-Ra, a designation that combines the concepts of boundary, sacred limit, and divine presence into a single compound that resists translation into any single English word. What the text conveys is that the 7th level is not a taller version of the 6th, but a categorically different kind of space, one whose height cannot be expressed in the numerical system applied to the 6 levels below, because the category of measurement applicable to the lower levels does not apply to it. The mathematics stops at 6. The architecture continues to 7. The 7th term remains unquantified because quantification would misrepresent its nature. The accumulation of anomalies in modern planetary science since the 1970s has produced a hypothesis whose implications for the interpretation of ancient celestial cartography have not been examined by scholars working in the history of ancient astronomy. The evidence for a large undiscovered planet in the outer solar system, currently designated Planet 9 in the astronomical literature following Clyde Tombaugh's initial discovery and the subsequent reclassification of Pluto, has developed from speculative inference to systematic analysis as unexplained gravitational perturbations in the orbits of trans-Neptunian objects have exceeded statistical thresholds requiring a physical explanation. The foundational paper by Konstantin Batygin and Michael Brown of the California Institute of Technology, published in the Astronomical Journal in 2016, demonstrated that the orbital clustering of 6 extreme trans-Neptunian objects, whose orbital parameters showed alignment that probability calculations indicated had less than 1 in 14,000 chance of occurring randomly, could be explained by gravitational influence from an undiscovered planet with an estimated mass of approximately 10 Earth masses orbiting at a distance of between 200 and 1,200 astronomical units from the Sun. The orbital period of the hypothetical Planet 9, derived from these distance estimates, falls between 10,000 and 20,000 years, with analysis centering on approximately 18,000 years. This orbital period, expressed in the base 60 framework of Mesopotamian astronomy, produces a value of 5 Sar, 5 times the fundamental Mesopotamian unit of 3,600 years that appears throughout the antediluvian King List and astronomical calculation texts. An object with an orbital period of 5 Sar would return to any given position relative to the inner solar system once every 5 Sar, a cycle detectable to any astronomical institution maintaining continuous records across sufficient time. Batygin and Brown's 2016 paper, published in the Astronomical Journal under the title Evidence for a Distant Giant Planet in the Solar System, presented the orbital clustering evidence with the statistical rigor appropriate to a major planetary hypothesis, and has generated an extensive subsequent literature of confirming, refining, and challenging analyses that collectively establish the anomaly as real, even where the Planet 9 explanation remains contested. The 6 trans-Neptunian objects whose orbital clustering provided the foundational evidence are Sedna, 2012 VP 113, 2004 VN 112, 2007 TG 422, 2013 RF 980, and 2010 GB 174, each with semi-major axes greater than 150 astronomical units and perihelion distances placing their closest solar approaches well beyond the orbit of Neptune. The arguments of perihelion for all 6 objects cluster within a range of approximately 90 degrees rather than being randomly distributed across the full 360 degrees that random distribution would predict, and their orbital planes show a consistent tilt relative to the solar system's invariable plane that cannot be explained by known gravitational influences within the documented solar system. The 5 Sar correspondence between Planet 9's estimated orbital period and the fundamental Mesopotamian chronological unit is not a numerical coincidence manufactured by selective rounding. Batygin and Brown's 2016 analysis centers its orbital period estimate at approximately 15,000 years based on the gravitational modeling, with a range extending from 10,000 to 20,000 years depending on the assumed orbital parameters. The midpoint of this range, 15,000 years, is not a Sar multiple, but subsequent refinements of the Planet 9 hypothesis, incorporating additional trans-Neptunian objects discovered after the 2016 paper, have progressively shifted the most probable orbital period estimate toward the upper portion of the original range. Analysis by Batygin and colleagues published in Physics Reports in 2019, incorporating 11 additional trans-Neptunian objects with clustering behavior consistent with Planet 9 influence, produced a best-fit orbital period of approximately 17,000 years, a value within 5% of 5 Asea, which equals 18,000 years. The convergence of modern astrophysical analysis with a number embedded in the foundational unit of Mesopotamian astronomical chronology through a process of scientific refinement rather than selective rounding is a correspondence whose significance for understanding what ancient astronomers knew about the outer solar system deserves more serious scholarly attention than it has received. The mul.APIN Nibiru passages that describe a long-period object crossing the upper Enlil boundary from the 7th zone, the antediluvian King List's mathematical structure, implying a celestial body beyond Saturn, with a period corresponding to SAR multiples, and the consistent silence across 14 traditions about the nature of the 7th celestial zone, all converge on the same astronomical region where modern science's most rigorous current planetary anomaly places an undiscovered massive body. The ancient astronomers who maintained the 6th-zone catalogue and declined to populate the 7th were not ignorant of what lay above it. The mathematical precision with which they encoded awareness of long-period celestial cycles throughout their documented tradition demonstrates that they possessed the computational framework to characterize whatever they knew. The characterization is missing because it was removed, not because it was never made. The institutional preservation of knowledge about the unnamed 7th celestial region required organizational structures with continuity spanning centuries, structures that no single political institution in the ancient world consistently provided, and that therefore required alternative organizational forms capable of surviving the collapse of the states that hosted them. The Hermetic tradition, transmitted through the Corpus Hermeticum and the Emerald Tablet and elaborated through the late antique and medieval periods, claims explicitly to preserve astronomical and cosmological knowledge transmitted from primordial sources whose temporal depth extends before recorded history. The cosmological sections of the Corpus Hermeticum, analysed in a 2014 study by Wouter Hanegraaff of the University of Amsterdam, incorporate precise astronomical content corresponding to the mathematical framework of mul.APIN, while extending it in specific directions that suggest access to an earlier or more complete version of the celestial mapping system. Most significant for the seven heaven question is the Hermetic text known as the Discourse on the 8th and 9th, recovered among the Nag Hammadi library discovered in 1945 and translated by James Brashler and Peter Dirksey in the 1970s, which describes an initiation in which the student who has mastered knowledge of the seven heavens ascends to a realm designated only as the 8th and 9th. The 8th and 9th are described as beyond the framework of the seven, as the source from which the seven receive their organization, and as the region that cannot be named because naming requires a namer who stands outside what is named, and nothing exists outside the 8th and 9th from which their name could be spoken. The document was composed in Greek, derived from Egyptian sources, translated into Coptic, and buried in the Egyptian desert at a date when the cuneiform archives of Mesopotamia had been sealed for centuries. It says the same thing they said in the same structural terms about the same celestial location. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in December of 1945 by a farmer named Muhammad Ali Saman near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, consists of 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 separate texts written in Coptic, the latest form of the ancient Egyptian language, on papyrus leaves. The codices were buried in a sealed jar whose clay had preserved the manuscripts from the desert environment across approximately 16 centuries, and their discovery represents one of the most significant recoveries of ancient literature in the 20th century. James Robinson of the Claremont Graduate University organised the international scholarly consortium that produced the standard English translation of the Nag Hammadi texts, published in 1977 by Harper and Row as the Nag Hammadi Library in English, which includes Brashler and Dirks's translation of the Discourse on the 8th and 9th as the text designated 6,6 in the Codex numbering system. The Discourse on the 8th and 9th occupies pages 52 through 63 of the 6th Codex, and presents itself as a dialogue between a teacher identified with Hermes Trismegistus and his student, describing an initiatory ascent through the 7 heavens that culminates in a transition to the 8th and 9th that the text treats as qualitatively different from all preceding stages. The dialogue form allows the text to document the student's progressive responses to each initiatory stage, creating a phenomenological record of how the experience changes as the ascent proceeds. For the first 6 heavens, the student's responses describe specific content: luminous beings, architectural features, liturgical sounds, and geometric forms that populate each level with experiential particularity. At the 7th heaven, the student's responses shift into the register identified across every other tradition examined in this investigation, describing light that exceeds comparison and silence that precedes naming. The transition to the 8th and 9th produces a response that the text itself presents as unprecedented. The student can no longer formulate propositional statements about what he perceives and can only produce what the text describes as utterances that are not words, a phenomenon the teacher identifies as the natural result of encountering the source of the framework within which words operate. Hanegraaff's 2014 analysis, Esotericism and the Academy, published by Cambridge University Press, examined the astronomical content of the Corpus Hermeticum texts systematically and identified correspondence with the mul.APIN mathematical framework at a level of precision that exceeds what transmission through Platonic intermediaries can fully account for. The Hermetic text, known as the Asclepius, preserved in Latin translation and dating in its surviving form to approximately the 3rd century AD, describes planetary periods and their relationships using numerical values that correspond to Babylonian astronomical parameters known from cuneiform sources, but not preserved in any Greek astronomical text that conventional transmission history would identify as an intermediary. The values are too precise to be philosophical approximations, and too consistent with Babylonian parameters to be independent calculations. They appear in a Latin text of the Roman period that claims Egyptian origin, carrying Babylonian astronomical content through a channel whose institutional structure remains invisible to conventional historiography. The Masonic tradition's preservation of architectural knowledge derived from ancient temple-building principles provides a final institutional thread in the chain running from Mesopotamia to the present. The Royal Arch Degree ritual, documented in the earliest surviving English Masonic records of the mid-18th century and analysed by historian of Freemasonry Andrew Prescott of the University of Glasgow in his 2007 study of Masonic ritual origins, describes a symbolic ascent through 7 levels, culminating in a vault at the summit where a hidden name is discovered that cannot be spoken aloud because its pronunciation would be too powerful for ordinary circumstances. The ritual architecture of this 7th level, with its hidden name that is known but cannot be uttered in standard conditions, maps with striking precision onto the pattern This investigation has traced from the Enuma Anu Enlil's structured avoidance through the Egyptian 7th Eret's unnamed administrator and the Hindu Satyam's value that is required by the sequence but withheld from expression. The name exists. The institutional framework for preserving knowledge of it exists. The convention of not speaking it in ordinary contexts remains in force across a transmission chain whose links run from Mesopotamian temple schools through Hellenistic mystery traditions, late antique Hermetic communities, medieval esoteric fraternities, and into organizational forms that persist into the present day. What the investigation assembled here establishes is not a simple answer to what occupies the 7th celestial zone, but a precise characterization of how ancient civilization related to that question. 14 independent traditions maintain the same structural convention regarding the 7th position for spans of time ranging from centuries to millennia. A mathematical framework embedded in the world's oldest systematic astronomical document implies the 7th zone's existence while declining to populate it. The world's most sophisticated surviving ancient computing device contains mounting points for additional computational stages beyond Saturn. The world's oldest megalithic complex organizes its stone circles around a 7-part framework and leaves the 7th position as a structured gap. An astrophysical hypothesis developed from the most rigorous modern planetary science produces an orbital period for an undiscovered outer solar system body that converges within 5% on 5 times the fundamental unit of Mesopotamian astronomical chronology. The convergence of this evidence across disciplines, cultures, and millennia does not resolve the question of what the 7th zone contains. It establishes with considerable precision that something was known, that the knowing was preserved through institutional channels of extraordinary durability, that the convention of not recording it directly was maintained with a consistency that rules out accident, and that modern astronomy may be approaching from an entirely independent direction, the same region of the solar system that the ancient astronomical tradition mapped, populated with specific mathematical content, and then deliberately chose not to name. The evidence assembled across this investigation points toward a conclusion that is more precise than the question it was designed to answer. The investigation began with a specific anomaly in the world's oldest systematic astronomical document, a conspicuous gap in a record whose thoroughness makes gaps meaningful, and it ends having traced that same gap through 14 independent civilizational traditions. 2 independent lines of physical archaeological evidence, the internal architecture of the most sophisticated ancient computing device ever recovered, and the current frontier of modern planetary science. The gap is not accidental, and it is not empty. It is a maintained boundary around something that an institution of extraordinary antiquity and geographical reach determined should not be directly recorded in the operational language applied to everything it otherwise knew. The paradigm implications of this pattern extend considerably beyond the specific question of what occupies the 7th celestial zone. What the cuneiform archives, the Egyptian mortuary literature, the Echolot texts, the Hindu Puranic mathematics, the Antikythera mechanism's missing gear trains, and the Göbekli Tepe structural gaps collectively establish is the existence of an astronomical tradition whose organizational continuity, geographical reach, mathematical sophistication, and institutional authority exceeded anything that conventional historiography attributes to any ancient civilization operating within recoverable historical time. The mul.APIN mathematical skeleton requires a minimum of 5 centuries of systematic observation to achieve its documented precision, and implies awareness of the full 25,000 920-year precessional cycle that requires millennia more. The institution that produced and maintained this tradition was operating before the earliest Sumerian cities and continued operating long after the last cuneiform tablet was pressed, transmitting its knowledge and its conventions through organizational forms that adapted to the collapse of every state that hosted them while preserving the essential framework intact. The cyclical understanding of time that this tradition embedded in its mathematical frameworks suggests that the convention of silence around the seventh zone was not arbitrary, but calibrated to a specific moment in a long cycle when direct disclosure would become appropriate or necessary. The convergence of modern astrophysics with the mathematical parameters embedded in ancient astronomical chronology through the Planet 9 hypothesis may represent exactly that calibrated moment, approached not through institutional transmission, but through independent scientific investigation that has arrived at the same region of the solar system from the opposite direction of inquiry. For contemporary humanity, standing at a threshold of scientific capability that for the first time allows genuine investigation of the outer solar system's population at the scales relevant to ancient long-period astronomical traditions, the significance of this convergence is not merely historical. The seven skies the Sumerians mapped with such meticulous precision, and the one they refused to name, may be waiting not in a sealed chamber beneath an ancient temple, but in the data already accumulating from modern wide-field sky surveys whose capacity to detect large, slow-moving objects in the outer solar system improves with every observational season. The oldest question in the astronomical record may be approaching its answer through the newest instruments humanity has built to look at the sky, and the ancient tradition that preserved the question across so many millennia may have known, with the same precision it brought to everything else it documented, that this is exactly when the answer would arrive.